Chapter 1071. Lionel took a light breath, his body relaxing and his heartbeat becoming smoother. Beneath the gaze of the warriors of Earth and the heads of the invaders, he walked forward with a slow and deliberate pace. A crackling of force silently built around him as a spear appeared in his palm. Even beneath this artificial atmosphere, it was difficult for sound to travel very far. It made the heaviness of Lionel's steps feel just that much more substantial as his king's might spread outward, an aura of undeniable superiority bearing down upon the junior starship. In the face of 5 sixth-dimensional experts, Lionel didn't flinch, he didn't wait for them to come to him, he didn't even show an ounce of hesitancy. These were his lands, his people. Unless they could get past his blade, they could forget about stepping foot on Earth. The blood of those around Lionel boiled. He didn't give an impassioned speech, he didn't goad at their insecurities or pry into their dreams. Instead, he took the simplest and most direct form of action. Lionel had always believed in this truth. A king should be at the very front. When you felt weak, look toward his back. When you felt that the mountain ahead was too tall and the task was too difficult, look toward his back. When you were on your last legs, your lungs on fire, your limbs unresponsive, your energy drained to its final drop, look toward his back. This weight on my shoulders is too light. Visit. For a better user experience amid the silence, Lionel's voice pierced through it all. It boomed amid the stars, seemingly causing them to twinkle in response. In that moment, a cube appeared above Lionel's head as his foot rose and fell. Its jigsaw pieces were all attached by a dully glowing lighting, making it look quite enigmatic as it hung there in their silence, an ominous feeling being exuded from it. When Lionel's foot touched upon the chains once again, he vanished, appearing in the air above the 5 heads and falling down at an ever-quickening pace. He streaked down like a falling meteor, his gaze hidden behind his flickering silver-black visor. Star fusion. Bang. Lionel's body suddenly erupted with a vibrant blue light. It shot out from the gaps in his armor like jet fuel, his strength skyrocketing in the blink of an eye. The sudden oppression was so violent and heavy, not to mention bright, that Lionel seemed to have taken up center stage. The segmented cube burst to life, its pieces fragmenting and spreading outward. A surge of pure energy swept out from within its depths, matching the very same radiant vital star force that Lionel was making use of right this very moment. Bang. Lionel landed heavily on the helm of the junior starship, its body waving about wildly beneath the control of the countless heavy chains. His armor continuously billowed with bluish-white vapor, his aura still steadily climbing even as the metal beneath his feet crumpled and shattered. Visit. For the best no_undershinji experience, he rose up his dual-sided spear, an arc of blue force following its path. It seemed to draw a line through the air, its body vibrating wildly with excitement. When the blade stopped, it pointed toward the 5 heads, radiating a blinding light. A subtle silence fell over the battlefield once again before thousands of roars pierced into the dark veil above. The warriors of Earth responded with their own pride, their blood surging to unconscious degrees as their gazes glazed over and their hearts beat wildly. Each and every one of them suddenly gained a slightly violet hue to their force, their strength rising by a half step. The chains rattled and the platform shook. One after another, the warriors began to charge. The people of Camelot, the people of the moon, the young noble men and women, the geniuses from lesser families, the army veterans. All at once, they brandished their blades and weapons, appearing on the junior starship and lighting the final spark of battle. Lionel's 8 brothers grinned wildly, their force rising like tides and their muscles bulging. The one with the least kills washes Raj's laundry for a year. Gil roared. And what if Raj is last? Milan laughed. Visit. For a better user experience, then he has to wear a thong for just as long. Gil's body sparked with crimson lightning. In the blink of an eye, he vanished, not even giving the others time to protest. Lionel stood before the 5 heads, his force still billowing wildly. Torrents of the bluish-white vapor rose up and away, even making his blade seem like it was being steamed beneath a smoldering heat. Even as the battle erupted, the 5 heads didn't move. They looked toward Lionel with brows furrowed, seemingly not realizing that their starship had suddenly fallen into a battle they weren't ready for. With the people of Earth taking the initiative like this and their warriors not being organized, it could very quickly become a problem. However, what was more shocking about all of this was that Lionel actually dared to face them. Not only did he dare to face them, but exactly what had just happened to their junior starship? On top of that, why was it suddenly so difficult for them to absorb force? And what was this blue force coming off of Lionel in waves? It was clear that Lionel actually planned on stopping them all himself, but wasn't this too ridiculous? Was he an idiot? Or was there something else that they were missing? Lionel didn't move a single inch, his blade still stretched forward in an act of blatant provocation. His breathing was steady and his back was straight. Nothing could make him waver at this moment. He's bluffing. What are you all still waiting for? Kill him. The first one to act was Averon. He didn't even wait for the others to react after he spoke. He struck forward with a palm instantaneously. In that moment, it felt as though the world was collapsing. Even in the face of Lionel's earlier momentum, it was like an impossibly vast mountain, towering above, unblemished. The latest _sodies are on _the website. Beneath his visor, Lionel's gaze flickered. Shit. Chapter 1072. Lionel had indeed been stalling. He needed to take the initiative so that the morale of Earth could be as high as possible. That was why he had acted so recklessly. Thankfully, due to the chaos of the current battlefield, all of which was taking place on a singular 10-kilometer-long ship, it was harder for them to actually pay attention to what was going on in Lionel's battle. This was especially so since Lionel and the five heads were still on the roof of the ship while many of the other battles had begun within the ship itself. Lionel was trying not to move right now because this inaction would cost him the least amount of vital star force. If he went all out, he could last in this state for 3 to 5 minutes max. If he added the supplementation of the segmented cube into the mix, he could last about half an hour. The trouble was that the segmented cube's supply was limited. Right now he was using what remained of the excess energy it absorbed, but it was only a tiny sliver. The only reason there seemed to be so much was because that tiny sliver was 7th dimensional and Lionel had converted it to 5th dimensional vital star force. But Averon had actually been so impolite as to actually attack. That would make things troublesome. Lionel quickly reacted. Duality. His spear swung forth, slicing the palm force in half. But he was blasted backward to the edge of the ship, his armor fracturing before quickly mending itself beneath the large amounts of star force. Averon frowned. He had only casually thrown out a palm, but he hadn't expected Lionel to truly be capable of receiving it. In fact, Lionel didn't even seem to be particularly hurt. What is this weird feeling? Visit. For a better user experience, Averon felt an odd oppression around him, as though a formless energy had taken form and latched onto his skin like a thick humidity would. But he couldn't truly touch or feel it, it was as intangible as it got. That's impossible. My attack was weakened, but there shouldn't be any ability a fifth-dimensional existence could possibly have that could weaken me? Averon couldn't wrap his head around it. The gap between dimensions wasn't a simple step. You were quite literally shedding your imperfections to become a greater being. This was why a powerful ability might be so in a lower dimensional world, only to become useless in a higher dimensional one. Many who were born in the Milky Way who had brought their abilities to the 3rd or 4th level of their ability index, might not even be at the 2nd level upon stepping into a higher world. Knowing this, how could Averon not be shocked? He had actually felt his attack weaken just then. Lionel's head leaned from side to side, his neck cracking. He took a deep breath and waited for the rumbling of his inner organs to calm. Then he began to pour his king's might into his duality domain, its layers becoming sturdier and sturdier with each passing moment. Go kill the rest. Averon said coldly. I alone am enough to deal with him. Is that so? Lionel's cold voice sounded. Visit. For the best understanding experience in that moment, it felt like he was whispering into all of their ears, causing the heads to remain rooted in place. Head Umbra especially narrowed his gaze, his feet spreading apart and his back arching as though he was prepared to pounce at any moment. An alert of danger sounded off in their minds. I promise you that the first of you to try to leave this battle we have here will die. Care to try it out? The five heads stared at Lionel for a long time. There were a few that wanted to call his bluff, but seeing Silem's reaction, they weren't foolish enough to do so. The Umbra family head had the best instincts of them all. If he was reacting like this, they would truly be asking for death if they ignored it all. They could only look toward the youth before them, their nerves standing on end. See, isn't this better? If we all just stand here, everything will be fine. Lionel said lightly. Bang. At that moment, a pillar of fire shot out from the hull of the junior starship. Several screams of agony followed it as what looked to be dozens of Flora family members were tossed into the depths of space. Oh, their ashes were tossed into the depths of space anyway. The gaze of Belize turned crimson when she saw this, her large belly rolling and the spider lily growing from her forehead writhing. The latest _sodies are on _the Website. Attack him as one. When he's dead, there won't be any threat left. Lionel watched on coldly from within his visor. This was exactly what he needed. As long as they weren't attacking others, he could do what he needed to do. Taking a steady and long breath, Lionel concentrated his duality domain, imprisoning the 6 of them. Before him stood 5 sixth-dimensional existences. In fact, they weren't normal Tier 1 sixth-dimensional existences either, each of them was at least Tier 3 or 4. To any objective outside observer, Lionel was seeking death. In fact, even Lionel felt that he was a bit too crazy. But in life, there were certain things you had no choice but to do. This weight on my shoulders is still too light. Lionel exhaled, his universal force surging. Ash-colored snow began to fall from the skies even as 5 radiant cores appeared before him. Lionel chose to forego a slow death and golden drops, focusing all his strength into radiant core and withering snowfall. Visit. For a better user experience, there was no path for a loss. Even if he died today, he had to win. He would win. Lionel's ankle flexed downward, his calf springing to life and his thigh bulging. When you couldn't afford to take a step backward, the true strength of a person would shine through. Chapter 1073. The metal beneath Lionel's feet crumbled as he vanished. His spear spun in his hands, wild lines of silver, white and blue following its arcs. It felt as though it was both everywhere and nowhere at the same time, touching upon a realm of speed, dexterity and skill that made the pupils of the 5 heads constrict. When Lionel appeared once again, the lines of his blade became less important than the shimmering mark of the golden spear that hung before his forehead. The world fell into a calm silence as every stroke of his blade suddenly gained the ever so slightest golden hue. It wasn't immediately obvious to the 5 heads just exactly which of them he was attacking. The current Lionel felt like the center of a budding rose, his blades outlining each petal one by one. Before the 5 realized it, his blade had appeared before Belize, descending with every intention of splitting her skull in 2. Is this a joke? Belize's rage-filled eyes hardly fluctuated as she reached out a finger. But before she could counter, her expression slightly changed. A swarm of ash snowfall disrupted her flow of force, shocking her and causing her reaction to be slightly slow. A spray of blood shot into the air as her finger was severed. The line of blood played beneath the whites, silvers and blues, looking especially striking in contrast. Belize didn't feel pain or rage for just a moment, her expression colored in shock. She turned her gaze toward Lionel, but the latter had already vanished, appearing to her back. Visit. For the best experience, Lionel's figure seemed to be enveloped by a shadow as his spear pierced forward. His technique shifted, his demeanor morphing and his artistic conception became several times more layered. A radiant core appeared before his piercing blade, a spiraling spear force beginning to spin wildly about it. The force became so fast that the core itself vanished, as did the spear blade. All that was left was a drill of pulsing energy, carrying the momentum to pierce all things with it. Belize, who had still not quite begun to take Lionel seriously despite Silem's reaction, was in a daze. She had just had her finger cut off by a 5th-dimensional ant. Her world spun about her and she couldn't quite regain her bearings. By the time she realized that her back was about to be skewered, it felt like it was all too late. Unfortunately, there were 4 others. At that moment, Cirrus Midas' hand reached down like a clamp. Without a care for the spinning blades or the radiant core, his fingers scraped through the air as though grating against metal. The sheer force of his strike left tears in the artificial atmosphere, leaving a trail of true space for just a moment. Bang! The sight was enough to shake one to their core. It was like watching a mortal stop a drill the size of their body with nothing more than a hand. Motes of shattered blade lights spun about wildly, some cutting into Belize's back and some even slicing into Lionel himself. And yet for Cirrus, his hand remained completely unscathed. It was as though he had just stopped spinning cotton. But somehow, visit. For the best experience, retreat. Silem's voice boomed. Unfortunately, it was already too late. Level 2 spear force might have been a 5th-dimensional equivalent, but much like domains, it existed in a categorization of its own, allowing it to affect those of higher dimensions. Even for Cirrus, who had an extraordinarily powerful body, such spear force would at least leave shallow marks on his skin. The fact it left nothing at all smelled of a conspiracy. And a conspiracy was exactly what it was. Bang! The radiant core imploded on contact, attaching to Cirrus' arm and Belize's back like leeches. On the surface, radiant core looked like a bundle of flames, but it was fundamentally very different from this. Radiant core was Lionel's artistic conception for summer, an artistic conception built on the core of a disaster world. The core of a planet wasn't a ball of flames. It was a ball of molten metal. Belize shrieked, feeling as though her body was being burnt from the inside out. She and Dolores had, by far, the weakest defenses of the five, making them easy first targets. It wasn't long before the smell of cooked skin and fat rose into the air. Visit. For a better user experience, it would be one thing if Lionel had formed his radiant cores normally this time around. But what if he had formed them with the very same shearing or he had taken from Averon's younger brother? The radiation of the radiant core wasn't potent enough to affect sixth-dimensional existences, but this heat and metal most definitely would be. Plants sprung up around Belize's feet as Cirrus' clawed hand changed angles and swung for Lionel. However, Lionel had long since retreated, his figure blinking several times, jumping a meter or two backward every moment. But when the four heads expected Lionel to take another meter or two step back with his fourth blink, he suddenly vanished. Dolores' pupils constricted, feeling danger bearing down on her. Beneath the ash snowfall, she couldn't seem to accumulate her rain clouds. To make matters worse, even if it hadn't been for Lionel's artistic conception, the odd environment they were in made it difficult to deploy area of effect abilities, especially ones that relied on atmospheric force. That said, after watching Belize suffer and seeing that Cirrus had taken serious damage as well, Dolores would never be caught off guard in the same way. During the fifth dimension, one's mind would be raised to another state. Dolores' speed of thought and the pace at which she processed information was far beyond the enemies that Lionel was used to dealing with. In a single exchange, she had already adapted and taken note of Lionel's propensity to scheme. Her dress fluttered and her palm struck out. The air rippled like the waves of a disrupted lake. Without waiting for the result, her palm flipped over, revealing a sapphire blue whip that instantly arched through the air right for Lionel. Visit. For the best no_vel_underscored_G experience. Chapter 1074. The whip was fast and swift. Despite having used the palm as a diversion tactic, the whip itself actually reached Lionel first, causing his pupils to constrict. For one, this told him just how cautious Dolores was being, and it marked a change in attitude amongst the five of them. Secondly, it revealed the true strength of these sixth-dimensional monsters. It was clear at a glance that Dolores was using nothing more than level 1 whip force. However, the sixth-dimensional force backing it made Lionel's level 2 spear force look like nothing more than child's play. However, this was a reality that Lionel had already long since become ready for. Duality. In that instant, Dolores' whip accelerated, its tip turning into pure water force. But, under her own astonished gaze, it shot over Lionel's head, missing him by several centimeters. What? The flat of Lionel's blade shot upward, slapping Dolores' whip even further off course. It was a subtle tap that hardly slowed his forward momentum, but simply due to the fact that her momentum had already been heading in that direction, the change was exponential. By the time she realized Lionel had closed the distance, it was too late to pull her whip back. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_G experience, however, Dolores didn't panic. Her whip had reached Lionel much faster, but that just meant that her palm energy was still a layer of protection for her. Though it was sent out quickly, it still carried at least 50% of her strength. Duality. Dolores' palm strike suddenly decreased to half its size, allowing Lionel to slide by it with deft steps. Blinding golden lights wrapped around Lionel's body, his speed stepping onto a completely new tier as he flashed through space once again. His spear spun before snapping into place, the momentum carrying his blade toward Dolores' neck. Dolores still had an arm up, connected to her whip. As for the other, it was still in the position of sending out a palm strike, but the energy from it had long since been dissipated. Still, she was an expert among experts. How many battles had she already been through in her lifetime? To be outmaneuvered by a child several times in a row was already humiliating enough. She most definitely wouldn't allow him the satisfaction. Her force circulated, her eyes glowing with a gentle blue. Separation, visit. For a better user experience duality. Lionel's blade suddenly accelerated, causing Dolores' eyes to widen. The skin on her neck bloomed with a touch of red. In that moment she truly felt the scent of death, her body freezing over and the horror being painted clearly on her lovely features. It was right then that her body collapsed into a pool of water, Lionel's blade cutting through the curtain of liquid blue but ultimately gaining nothing. A moment later, Dolores reformed from a surge of water, her face pale and crimson dripping down her swan-like neck. Her blue dress still fluttered, but its collar was slowly being dyed red, her chest heaving as she was caught between shock, horror and rage. Lionel stopped moving, suddenly finding himself encircled by 5 absolute experts. Averon and Asylum had yet to move an inch. Cirrus had chopped off his hand at the wrist, and yet had already replaced it with a bronze fist he likely got from Averon, resulting in his combat prowess practically being the same. Finally, there was Dolores was bleeding and Belize, who was in the worst situation of the 5 by far. The sight of Belize right now was truly horrid. Her entire back had been covered in Lionel's molten metal. By now, she had already gone through several flower constructs, each of them burning to ash as they tried to deal with the situation. Right this moment, if not for the massive carnivorous plant sucking at her back like a leash, she might have been dead already. In fact, her state was so bad that all of her clothing had already been burnt to a crisp. Only the vines of her leech flower were keeping up her modicum of modesty at this point. Lionel took a deep breath, his body thrumming. Visit. For a better user experience, his duality domain allowed him to pick a character to shift the balance of. This character could be either speed or power, and how much Lionel wanted to shift it decided how easy or difficult it would be. The difficulty was also influenced by whether he was giving or taking away as well. Obviously, when facing 6-dimensional existences, doing this was almost impossible. And even the small bit he could only manage a few percentage points of a percent. This was where Lionel's genius came into play. He didn't need to take away from them, why not give them more power? Not only would this cost almost nothing to him as he was taking away from himself, but it would also throw the timing of these experts completely off. A few percentage points here and there with Lionel's calculative abilities was enough to change the tide of battle completely. It was just unfortunate that he didn't manage to kill even a single one of them before they noted that he could do this. "I'm going to kill you." Both Belize and Dolores spoke at that same time, their fury and humiliation being practically palpable. Lionel didn't respond, his gaze remaining as cold as ice. In the skies above, the fluttering ash continued to fall. 4 radiant cores spun silently around Lionel. "I see. You're using angles to your advantage." Xylem spoke lightly, a twin pair of jet black daggers appearing in his hands as snaking black tails slowly rose out from his back. "But I wonder what good accelerating my attack will do for you if my blade is completely straight?" Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel's pupils constricted. But they hardly had time to do even that before the blade appeared right before him. Lionel tried to dodge, but the blade pierced through his armor without suspense, splitting his collarbone in 2 and threatening to take his entire arm with it. Chapter 1075. The pain was like a shock through Lionel's system. It felt as though his entire arm had been dipped into a vat of lava. Even the smallest twitch sent signals that felt like arm-thick strikes of lightning right to his mind. Xylem, who had casually thrown his dagger over as a test, was now rightfully assured, and his words enlightened the others. So long as they were facing directly in front or directly behind the path Lionel was taking, it would simply be impossible for his domain to be of any use. Lionel coughed up a mouthful of blood, but there wasn't any time for leisure. The 5 heads had already moved. Lionel's steps shifted, his body falling out of the way of a swing of Xylem's tail. The sound of whistling wind shot over his head even as Cirrus swung in his direction with his new bronzed fist. Lionel rolled to the side, his palm latching onto the dagger stuck in his shoulder, having had no choice but to put his spear away to do so. His left arm couldn't move at all and his right hand pulled at the dagger, the searing pain racking his body. Xylem didn't say anything toward this, but his gaze twinkled. In that moment, Lionel felt as though tendrils of darkness had drilled their way into his body, anchoring the dagger within him. They reached outward, drilling through his flesh and squirming toward his heart. The feeling was both the most disgusting and the most painful thing that Lionel had ever experienced in his life. His body. Xylem's irises flashed. Using such a technique against a 5th-dimensional existence should have meant an instant death. But Xylem had actually already used more strength than he would have to even against some 6th-dimensional existences, and yet he was still several seconds away from Lionel's heart. The latest _IP_SODIs are on _the website. The shock of this made Xylem almost miss something that was even more baffling. Where was the scream? At that moment, Lionel's gaze had become frighteningly cold. A murky crimson crept through his irises, mixing with the original pale violet. He felt absolutely furious at this moment, but it only made him calmer and more detached. Dolores' wrist flexed, her instincts catching hold of an opportunity. Her whip reacted in kind, tearing a path through the air and right for Lionel's other shoulder. The golden spear on Lionel's forehead flashed, but he didn't move. Or rather, it seemed like he didn't have the time to move. The whip's tip turned into pure water force once again, lashing against Lionel's right arm and shattering the sleeve of his armor into tiny little pieces. In the blink of an eye, all that was left behind was a beaten and bruised arm covered in bronze runes that had lost much of their light. Cyrus rapidly approached. Long-distance combat was most definitely not his forte. Seeing how easily Lionel dodged his earlier fist force and seeing his current state, he no longer held back, charging forward. However, he quickly found 4 radiant cores blocking his path. The pressure of what had happened earlier weighed on Cyrus' heart. He retreated explosively, but Lionel didn't dare to allow his radiant cores to travel too far from himself. Visit. For a better user experience, rolling to the side to avoid another attack, Lionel flexed his beaten and bruised right arm. A surge of vital star force returned, pouring into his pores from the segmented cube above and quickly healing his injuries. His arm flipped over, revealing a javelin. He quickly planted his leg, his torso torquing as he unleashed it with all his might. The streak of silver light appeared before Dolores in an instant, but she had long since been prepared. With another plop, Dolores collapsed into a pool of water, appearing even further away than last time. Right this moment, Silem's gaze had narrowed, gazing up at the segmented cube above Lionel's head. He hadn't missed the fact that Lionel had just healed himself using the energy coming from it. If not for the fact his dagger was slowly digging toward Lionel's heart, maybe that injury would have been dealt with already as well. Lionel suddenly exploded forward. Taking advantage in the gap of the encirclement that Dolores' retreat caused, Lionel's body alternated between a mad sprint and several teleportations. Beneath the influence of these 5-6-dimensional existences, he didn't dare to teleport too far, but he was supremely confident in these short spurts, and so long as he could just burst through. It was then that Averon, who had done little to nothing since the very start of this battle, took action. He pointed a singular finger toward a particular direction. The instant he did so, Lionel's expression changed and he came to a grinding halt. Visit. For a better user experience, a solid beam of bronze jetted outward, crashing into the metal flooring before Lionel and causing a massive upsurge of explosions. Averon drew a calm line down Lionel's exit path, the beam coming from his finger never breaking once. It was clear that he had found yet another weakness to Lionel's domain. What good was accelerating a continuous attack like this one? So long as it made it to Lionel's destination first, he would have no path toward escape. Averon took his time blocking Lionel's escape before his laser slowly began to push back, inching toward Lionel, who was forced into quickly retreating again and again. It was exactly then that Silem pounced. However, his goal wasn't Lionel, but was rather the segmented cube above his head. With a single whip of his tail, he crumpled the metal beneath himself and shot his body into the air, appearing near the segmented cube in the blink of an eye. No! Lionel shouted out for the first time since the battle began. But before he could do anything, Dolores' whip lashed out once more, this time carrying even more power than it did before. As distracted as Lionel was now, he was completely finished. But Dolores had never expected for the flustered Lionel to suddenly turn back toward her as though nothing had happened. She could almost feel the coldness of his gaze beneath his visor, causing her to shiver uncontrollably. Duality. Visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 1076. Silem's expression changed. He felt as though all the strength he had put into his daggers was suddenly sapped away. His control was broken in an instant, and all the effort he had put toward digging toward Lionel's heart went up in a puff of smoke. However, he was already in the air and the segmented cube was in arm's reach. Who cared what happened as long as Lionel could no longer heal himself? He had already torn a path through Lionel's bones and lungs. Practically the entire left side of his body had become nothing but a useless pile of mush. If he lost the ability to heal, he would be finished. It was right then that Lionel's arm reached out, grabbing onto the end of Dolores' whip to pull hard. At first, Dolores thought that Lionel had a death wish. Firstly, her whip had the ability to turn intangible just like she could. With just a thought, she could freely turn its body into pure water force. And secondly, did Lionel think that just because her whip looked flexible and flimsy that it truly was? A single snap of her weapon could shatter an entire mountain range. Even Cyrus wouldn't casually reach out to catch it. And yet, that was exactly what happened. Dolores' expression changed, immediately reacting to turn her whip into pure water force. But in that moment it felt like all the force she poured in was sucked out by a powerful vacuum. No matter how much effort she put in, her whip remained solid. By the time she realized the problem, it was already too late. Her body propelled through the air like a streak of blue. In one swift motion, Lionel released the whip and flipped his palm, revealing his spear once again. His arm, beaten and bloodied, erupted with vital star force, healing in the blink of an eye as he pierced forward with all his might. Visit. For a better user experience, a spiraling vortex of level 2 spear force manifested, twisting and spinning about Lionel's radiant core. No. Somehow, Dolores' screech made just how fake Lionel's earlier outcry was seem all the more obvious. They had been lured into a false sense of security. But their mistake was ever believing that they could be safe around Lionel at all. Zichi. Bang. Dolores' force shield was blown into smithereens. Her dress was shredded to pieces, allowing the underlying armor to save her life for just a moment. Unfortunately, Lionel's drill was too large. Her torso remained somewhat safe, but her arms, legs and head were all torn to shreds, causing a rain of blood to fall upon the battlefield. In ironic fashion, it was only after the head of the Rain family fell that the first rainfall followed. Xylem and the expressions of the others warped wildly. The idea that one of them could die had never truly crossed their minds. Xylem had no choice but to continue reaching for the segmented cube. But he too was stunned by what happened next. The segmented cube suddenly shifted, opening wide. Before Xylem could stop himself, he fell into the midst of the lights, vanishing before all their eyes. In a final struggle, his roar pierced through the battlefield, but he still vanished nonetheless. The latest _IP_SODs are on _the website. Bang. Lionel was sent flying as Averon's beam finally reached him. The back of his armor was torn to pieces and blood gushed down. However, that was all. Even with 5 now becoming 3, Lionel still stood. Coughing heavily, Lionel rose to his feet once more. He ripped the dagger out from his shoulder, vital star force erupting around him. Slowly, the pieces of his armor began to reform even as his body itself healed at a speed visible to the naked eye. The battlefield was quite chaotic at this moment, however there were still plenty of individuals who were still within earshot and eyeshot of this battle. Seeing the 5 Lionel was facing be whittled down to just 3, a surge of fire was lit beneath those of Earth while the exact opposite occurred for the invaders. I see. Averon spoke lightly. When your armor broke, you purposely revealed your broken and bruised arm, displaying none of the blue force. Then you absorbed it from the cube above even though you could produce it yourself to goad Xylem into falling for your trap. Now maybe the most dangerous one of us is out of the way for you, HM? But I really don't understand how you managed to gain enough strength to kill Dolores with a single strike. Lionel remained silent. No. It wasn't that you have the strength to kill her in a single strike, it was Xylem who did, right? Lionel's gaze narrowed, but he still said nothing. That odd power and speed displacement ability you have, I bet it works better based on proximity to HM? I guess we're all fools in your eyes then? Xylem was pouring in his own strength into your body, likely trying to kill you. But in the end, all he was doing was giving you the exact strength you needed to kill one of his allies. Fascinating. Averon looked Lionel up and down. Visit. For the best no_NG experience, you know so much about our abilities and you always act accordingly. Yet, we know absolutely nothing about yours and fall into such simple traps. Let me guess. You managed to open my younger brother's bronze eye? Lionel's gaze narrowed further, but silence was still his choice, his breathing becoming more and more even. He had only 10 more minutes of star force left, he couldn't afford to waste it. He needed to kill these 3 swiftly. He'll take your silence as affirmation. Averon chuckled. Cirrus, kill her. At that moment, Belize's expression changed. She had been putting so much effort into silently healing herself all this time, not having taken any action whatsoever. It was clear that she had expected something like this to happen. But now that it was actually happening, she was completely flustered. Cirrus sprung into action, brandishing his fists as he pounced toward Belize. Averon, you dare? Averon didn't even look in her direction. Instead, he looked into the skies as the boundary of this fold of reality began to splinter and crack once more. It's about time we end this. On the horizon, a second junior starship made its presence known. And it seemed that when it came to this one, Averon was confident that Lionel didn't know a thing about it. Visit. For the best no_NG experience. One more chapter coming today. Chapter 1077. The battlefield came to a grinding halt. The pressure of a second junior starship weighed down on them all. Lionel wasn't the only one who was having a tough battle. All around, blood and tears were being shed, flesh was being torn and bones were being shattered. They had all pushed so hard to reach this step, all for it to come crashing down on their heads like this. Space crackled and twisted, familiar streaks of black lightning nearly warping reality as it pushed its way through, having every intention of crushing everything that lay in its path. To the side, the battle between Cirrus and Belize raged on. However, the latter already hardly stood a chance. She was already on her last legs to begin with and had used up much of her force in an effort to heal herself. She did everything she could to try to get to Dolores' corpse, but it was all meaningless. Cirrus was far too familiar with the abilities of the Florer family. After centuries of battle, they finally had a chance to get a slight one-up on the Florer. How could they not take it? With a world to take root in and grab energy from, the strength the Florer were known for couldn't be displayed. To make matters worse, Belize had already used her elite spore in an attempt to heal herself. If she separated from it mid-process, not only would she worsen her injuries, but she might even directly die soon after. Boy, help me. Visit. For the best experience reaching out for a last line of hope, Belize looked toward Lionel. It was quite ironic. The boy that she had been looking down upon all this time might be her only chance at surviving. Don't be stubborn. There is no such thing as eternal enemies as long as the benefits are great enough. Even my Florer family chose to ally with these bastards for a time. Look at the bigger picture. If you remove these metals from my body, I can heal in just a few seconds. Alone I'm already powerful enough to fight these two. With you we can crush them. Lionel didn't even gaze toward Belize. Work with her? People like her were the absolute scum of the earth. Lionel had read about how the elite spores were formed. He couldn't even imagine how many thousands of lives Belize had sacrificed just to cause hers to sprout. To make matters worse, to get it to grow to its current size would have taken tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even without the earth to root in, with the elite spore, Belize was likely the most powerful warrior on this battlefield. That was why Lionel had taken her out first while all of them were still underestimating himself. Even now, he was tormenting her with the molten metal that was still stuck to her back. The fact she was alive at all was a testament to just how powerful she truly was. Boy. The latest _sodies are on the website. Belize almost lost her cool entirely, her rage reaching a palpable level. The truth was that her death wouldn't change much. They might have been the heads of their families, but there were still numerous elders and hidden experts they hadn't brought out for this battle. How could a mid-level sixth-dimensional world possibly only have a single sixth-dimensional expert? The reason Averone still insisted on killing her was because of her talent and the potential trouble she might bring in the future, in addition to the potential that she might be carrying something important about the Florer family's legacy. At the same time, even if she wasn't a talent or wasn't carrying anything so important, her death would guarantee that the Radix and Midas families would be able to monopolize Earth for themselves without having to share. Once these two families established themselves, even if the Florer, Umbra and Rain families came later, defending was far easier than launching an attack. By then, the power dynamic between the families would shift and in a few decades, the Radix and Midas would gain enough power to crush the Florer themselves and complete the legacy. Just think about it. This second junior starship has nothing to do with me. It's obvious that the Radix and Midas decided to send more experts. Without sixth-dimensional experts, how will Earth defend itself? Don't think that just because you killed Dolores that you can do it yourself. The trick you used with Xylem won't work twice and Dolores was by far the weakest of us all. In addition, now that they know how your ability works, they won't make the same mistake Xylem did again and you won't have a chance to kill another one of us with a single strike. The latest _sodies are on the website. I can tell that your body is very powerful and this is likely the reason you've been able to fight and harm us, but I can also tell that you're relying heavily on that blue force to boost your strength. How much more time will it buy you? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? Even if it will last you an infinite amount of time, I can tell you that it won't matter. These two are still hiding their ability indexes because they don't want to expose themselves. In addition, they've yet to use the true prowess of sixth-dimensional existences because this odd atmosphere is restricting it. But once this second junior starship descends, this environment you've created will shatter and their strength will at least double. I won't ask for much in return. Just save me and allow me a piece of the spoils. I won't take any of Earth's territory. I wouldn't even have the numbers left to continue fighting you all after this. The warriors of the other families would not listen to me. Belize did everything she could to convince Lionel, and all of her arguments were perfectly sound. In fact, though Averone had said nothing from start to finish, he was ready to stop Lionel at any time, his gaze firmly locked onto the ladder. However, Lionel himself was still looking toward the ship that had finally broken through the final layer, his gaze somewhat vacant, though it was difficult to tell beneath his visor. On the helm of this second junior starship, a man stood with a tall back and wide shoulders. Though Lionel had never personally laid eyes on him before, he almost instantly recognized this man as Guild Head Augustus Ovaltine. However, a half-step to the back of this man was a woman he was actually a bit surprised to see there. Not because she was alive, he had already guessed that. But it was rather that she was actually standing a half-step behind her father. He had thought that the two of them were enemies with differing goals. But if they weren't, that meant visit. For the best no underscores he experienced, Lionel's lips suddenly curled into a smile, his gaze shifting toward Averone. He could hardly control his amusement, causing his cold exterior to collapse. What? Did you all prepare a comedy skit just for me? You really shouldn't have. Averone's gaze narrowed. What the hell did Lionel mean by that? Chapter 1078. Up above, even Era's gaze narrowed. Lionel had very clearly seen her, but his reaction was actually so nonchalant. Was her survival really not that surprising to him? How could that be possible? Even up until now, you still don't get what's going on? Lionel looked toward Averone. Though his gaze was hidden behind his visor, his mockery was practically palpable. It hung in the air like a venomous snake, making Averone, who had always felt supremely confident in himself, feel his skin slowly become prickly and uncomfortable. At that moment, the forward momentum of the second junior starship came to a slow halt. The speed it had been building up to shatter the artificial atmosphere Lionel had built here dropped to zero, stunning Averone and the others. I'm not entirely sure why you think yourself to be so clever, Lionel continued. Did you think that just because one of you two protected her initially that I would forget that you were mortal enemies? Even now you don't understand that I could kill her whenever I want, so why do you think that she's still alive? Averone's gaze narrowed. He had forgotten one very important thing. From the beginning, the reason why they were forced to fight Lionel all at once instead of spreading out to support the rest of the battlefield was that they felt he was too dangerous. If one of them turned their backs away, they would most definitely die. And yet to this point, Lionel had yet to use that ability. On top of that, with Belize's current state, she would have been the easiest target to get rid of. So why was it that Lionel had hounded Dolores so much? Visit. For a better user experience at that moment, Belize, who no longer had the leisure to split her mind and her focus, screeched. Her voice was like that of a banshee, making all those who heard it feel as though their very blood was vibrating as their ears threatened to burst. I'll take you with me. The leech-like carnivorous plant attached to Belize's back suddenly pulsed as the spider lily on her forehead sprouted and bloomed. The roots of the spider lily double in size, wiggling beneath Belize's skin as it sucked her completely dry. In one moment she had been a morbidly obese woman. In the next she was nothing more than skin and bone, what remained of her face actually carrying some of the charm a beauty would have. Unfortunately, that beauty was warped by a twisted expression and a leeching spider lily that made it difficult to appreciate. Belize's naked form appeared before them all, but there were no curves or healthy, glossy skin. Her body had been completely drained of its blood and its fat. Being too weak even to walk on her own 2 feet, the vines of the carnivorous planet attached to her back propped her up, raising her into the air. With another vicious screech, a vine whipped outward, slamming into Cirrus. The devastation made Dolores' whip look like nothing more than child's play. The air split, the space cracked and Cirrus' ribs caved in as though a god had drawn a finger across his chest. In just a single attack, he was put in a half-dead state, shards of his own ribcage tearing into his lungs and heart as he coughed up several mouthfuls of blood. Visit. For the best no undershinji experience, Belize lost her rationality, chasing after Cirrus like a madman. See that? Lionel spoke casually as though he was watching theater. You. Averone's pupils constricted. Do you know how many battles between your radix and her Flora family are recounted in your records? Lionel continued to passively observe without a word. The answer is just 10,706. Of course, these aren't all of the battles, just the ones of note. Of those battles, about 2,803 of them are between experts of your families. These can be considered small-scale battles with between 2 to 5 people participating at once. Regardless, it's usually less than 10. Do you know how many of those battles your family won? Don't worry, it's a bit embarrassing, so you don't need to answer. The percentage is about 24%. As for how many the floor outright won, that would be about 57%. So, what do you think happened with the remaining 19%? Cyrus lost his arm to pure blunt trauma. Without relying on the slightest sharpness, it was ripped from his in terrible fashion, his blood pooling out to the ground. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscore_undersng experience. Fascinating, don't you think? Lionel asked. Of that remaining 19%, all of them were counted as draws. These weren't any normal draw, but rather they were draws where all parties died. Lionel looked away from the battlefield and back toward Averon. Now, if you're like me, you'd find this statistic to be weird. A situation where everyone dies is too odd, especially since your records didn't seem to have an explanation for it. And after reading through all the techniques and abilities of your Radix and Midas families, you most definitely didn't have what was necessary to force such a draw in a fifth of cases. The only logical answer, then, is that it wasn't you forcing the draw. It was rather the Flora family forcing it. And lo and behold, in 93% of the cases where the battle ended in a draw, it had been an ambush by your Radix family, meaning the Flora had been forced into a desperate situation and left without a choice but to use their hidden trump card. Averon's breathing was no longer as steady as it was before. This Lionel wanted him to believe that just by reading the outcomes of battles, he was able to deduce that the Flora family had a hidden ability that even they hadn't been aware of. Not only did he deduce this ability, but he was able to grasp the nature and even the timing of it to the point he could make use of it in his plans. Just what kind of monster was standing before him now? Just who was this Prince Lionel, and how could he possibly outcalculate his Radix family? Visit. For the best no_vil_undersng experience. Averon took several deep breaths. This wasn't the end of it, so what if the Flora had such an ability? The fact that Lionel dared to stand here meant that Belize had lost her rationality. She would likely burn herself out fighting Cyrus, and when she was dead, everything would go as planned regardless. This was all meaningless. So why did he still feel like Lionel was smiling? Chapter 1079. It made sense that the Radix never saw this pattern. They had accumulated this data over several centuries and they never categorized them in terms of wins, losses and draws, they just documented what happened. For Lionel to draw that connection himself after flipping through them spoke for itself. However, that didn't explain why any of this was important. I'm not entirely sure why you're so confused, Lionel said lightly. The fact you don't think it's important that you're standing here doing nothing while your supposed partner and equal is fighting down to his last breath doing something you commanded him to do. You don't really understand how people work, HM? Averon's pupils constricted. If you still don't get it, I can give you another stat, maybe that'll help things sink into place for you. Of those 10,706 battles fought, there were 17,092 members of your families that died. Of that number, 64% were from the Midas family. How about another stat? There were 27,893 participants of the battles total. That means that there were 10,801 survivors. Of the number of survivors, 72% of them were members of your Radix family. Averon's expression darkened with every word Lionel spoke. And now, once again, a member of the Radix family is watching a member of the Midas fight to the bloody end. But do you know what the difference is between this time and all those other times? Lionel smiled and looked around. You have spectators. Visit. For the best no_undersng experience, the battlefield had already fallen into a silence the moment the second junior starship appeared, and it felt like the tides were shifting. However, because of all the commotion and noise the battle between Belize and Cyrus were making, not to mention the distraction of Lionel's words, Averon hadn't even noticed the issue until it was pointed out to him. His gaze subconsciously swept about, only for him to find several members of the Midas family looking back toward him. His expression couldn't help but turn ugly. The glue that held the Radix and Midas together was the outside threat of the Flora family. The Flora were simply far too powerful, as they had monopolized an entire half of the inheritance all to their own. Without banding together, they would die separately. Due to this, a lot of the internal conflict between the two families was ignored and allowed to fester. But having a spotlight shone on it like now made the problem several orders of magnitude worse. Because the Midas always had such powerful bodies, and because the Radix were so calculative, the nature of these battle stats had always been an open secret. If there was anyone that would be smart enough to survive a close battle, it would more likely be the Radix. And now this scab wound would be torn open for all to see. But I know what you're thinking. Lionel continued with a smile. Or rather, I know what you'll eventually conclude because right now it seems that you're too flustered to think properly. Once this head of the Flora family dies beneath the backlash of her own technique, the Flora family will retaliate fiercely. After all, it's been 207 years since one of their heads has died, and last time that occurred, they were able to retrieve their corpse and not lose anything. Now, however, this woman will die in the midst of a battlefield with no other powerful enough members of the Flora family here to retrieve her. There's about an 83% likelihood that she's holding something supremely important and precious on her person as well. Visit. For a better user experience because of this inevitable and fierce coming retaliation, the Midas will have no choice but to swallow their discontent and your issues can once more be swept under the rug, right? But there's just a small problem with that. Lionel's head angled up to the second junior starship whose engine was still stalled. The problem is that you're a fool and you still think that they're on your side when they've obviously already decided to betray you. The moment Lionel said these words, both Era and her father narrowed their gazes. I bet you that by now, all of the members you bribed and placed on their council have been assassinated. I can also see, no matter how he tries to hide it, that gold-head Ovaltine has entered the sixth dimension. Now you think about it yourself. The goal of your Radix-Midas alliance is to combat the Flora family. The Midas allow the losses they've accrued over the years because when it comes down to it, your Radix family's intelligence is the backbone of your operation while they are the brawn. But what would happen if the largest scale plot you had cracked was thwarted by another? What if all the resources you had poured in, all the effort, was meaningless? How would the Midas continue to trust you all if you can't do the one thing you're meant to do? What are they losing their lives for every day if you can't complete a single task? Averon's chest heaved, his gaze practically red at this point. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. I'm not sure why it is that you're getting angry with me. I haven't done anything but point out the obvious. Your Radix family got played. If the Milky Way Guild succeeds in getting a foothold in Earth's fold of reality, you all won't even be that large of a threat to them anymore and everything you've done to this point would be meaningless. So, don't you agree with me? Isn't this a funny little skit you have going here? Averon suddenly began to laugh, the sounds of clinking resonating throughout his body as the gears of several mechanisms sprung to life. I'm going to enjoy killing you, he growled. The metal beneath Averon's feet warped as he suddenly shot forward. His strength bloomed and his force threatened to collapse the space he shot through. Since everything was falling apart around him, he would piece it together himself. In all this nonsense Lionel was spewing, he had forgotten that he was the most vulnerable person. However, it was then that Averon felt that something was wrong. Lionel stood there, unmoving as he rapidly closed the distance between them. It was as though he hadn't noticed the murderous intent at all. Lionel slowly shook his head. If it was possible for them to lose their minds to the point of getting hyper-fixated on a single person, how is it that all of them would die 19% of the time? Do you know why I haven't moved an inch since she began to rampage? It's because carnivorous plants find their prey based on movement. Visit. For a better user experience, a vine appeared above Averon's head, slapping down with the weight of a mountain. Dumbass. Bang. Chapter 1080? Averon's head was blasted into pieces. The power gap between a Belize who had activated her secret technique and him was simply too far apart. In fact, for the past several dozen seconds now, Belize had already been beating nothing more than Cirrus' corpse. The only reason the latter was even relatively intact was purely because of how powerful his body was. Nothing more, nothing less. Lionel watched as Averon crumpled before him. Bits and pieces of his skull and brain flew out in all directions, falling to Lionel's feet. His eyes only barely managed to remain intact, their gaze locked onto Lionel, flickering through a whirlwind of emotions. Various colors of anger, fury and rage, dipped in a layer of helplessness and pleading. But it was all meaningless. Even if Lionel wanted to save him, he couldn't. Healing a sixth-dimensional existence was beyond his abilities, not that he would even try to do so to begin with. The instant Averon plopped to his knees, another vicious vine whip descended from above, booming down again and again. He lost the rest of his head, then his neck, then torso. Eventually he was nothing but a lump of meat and metal heated through repeated pummeling. The entire battlefield remained silent as Belize rampaged about, not a single soul daring to move even an inch. Lionel could tell that there were a few madmen who wanted to sacrifice their own lives just to force him to move. He could sense the look in the eyes with his internal sight. But toward this he only smiled. He was very much ready for whatever they brought. Smartly of them though, they didn't take action in the end. Just 10 minutes later, Belize released a final screech, her wrinkled body writhing wildly as the spider lily on her forehead squeezed. In the next moment she fell into a pile of ash, the leech on her back screaming as it had lost its final support. The latest _sodies are on _the website. At that moment, Lionel suddenly sprung forward, a snow globe flickering in his hands as he stored away the carnivorous plant before it could truly wither away. As he was the only one even remotely close to the incident, no one was even in position to stop him. Then with light steps he walked to Averon's bloody pulp. Little Tali wiggled around Lionel's wrist, squeezing out from the cracks in his armor and burrowing into the steaming pile. When the little guy came out, it was still a pristine and shimmering silver as though it would forever remain unblemished. However, within its body, a large amount of sixth-dimensional ores had been excavated. In fact, the amount dwarfed Averon's younger brother by several measures. After working at his own pace for several moments, Lionel finally looked up to the ship above. By now, the father-daughter pair had been completely surrounded, several thousand oryx driving them into a corner. Their expressions remained placid, however the conclusion of all of this seemed quite obvious. At this moment, the people of Earth couldn't help but cast worshipful gazes toward Lionel's back. Although they weren't quite sure what was happening, it was clear by Lionel's earlier words and everything that happened after that he was well aware of how things would play out. Completely beside himself, Augustus began to clap slowly, his placid expression giving way to admiration. It was the kind of look one wouldn't expect to see from an enemy. Even Lionel could only say that he was taken aback. The truth of the matter was that he had gotten lucky and he knew it. If not for the oryx becoming such a backbone of the Milky Way Guild's plan, things wouldn't have been able to end so simply. Just the odds of such a thing happening alone were baffling, and yet he had greatly benefited from it. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel couldn't help but think what would happen if one day he was the unlucky one? This dimensional verse seemed so fickle at times. It was impossible that he would have every tidbit of information he'd need at every turn. If by some miracle, Lionel gained that ability, it would be amazing. He didn't believe that there was anyone he could ever lose to if he did. But, was that even realistic? I have to awaken Goggles as soon as possible. Only when I have someone with his abilities by my side can things become a bit easier. I can only say that I should have killed you that day. Augustus said lightly. I've lost thoroughly. Lionel didn't need to think much to know what Augustus was talking about. That day on planet Solara he had definitely locked onto him. However, Augustus had chosen not to act to stop Lionel back then, likely wanting to use him as a tool to whittle down the geniuses of the Radix and Midas families. But in the end that choice came back to bite him. You were just unlucky, Lionel said lightly. Augustus gazed toward Lionel deeply. The latest _sodies are on _the website. Right now he had more than enough power to charge out of this encirclement and leave this place. But, then what? He had spent his entire life building the Milky Way Guild. Before coming here, he had killed off more than 70% of their core strength, weeding out the plague that had been infecting them for so long. Now they were nothing more than a shell of their former selves. Augustus had wanted to use this foothold in Earth's fold of reality to recoup his losses, but he had been stonewalled before his dreams could even take flight. Hearing Lionel's words, he wanted to be angry, but he was appreciative at the same time. This young man's view on life. It was one even he could admire. Only those at the bottom thought that everything was due to luck. Only those at the top thought that everything was due to hard work. To meet a young man who could be so superior to those around him and yet acknowledge the nuance of it all was rare. Rare indeed. Era stood in silence, her gaze locked onto Lionel from start to finish. The latest _sodies are on _the website. Second chapter OTW. Chapter 1081. This doesn't have to be the end if you don't want it to be, Lionel suddenly said. You also don't have to rebuild everything from scratch. Augustus' gaze narrowed. What do you mean by this? Well, that would depend on how much your daughter hates me and how much you value that hatred. Lionel responded with another hypothetical. Augustus' frown deepened, but he didn't immediately look toward his daughter. He knew well that his daughter's feelings for her late fiancé weren't fake. And he knew his daughter's temperament well. Bending wasn't something she took too kindly to. Even if she bent now, there was a good chance she would snap back in the future. However, before he could think any more, Era suddenly spoke. Rhea and Sil. Where are they? Lionel didn't need to think long to remember who these two were. Sil was Anared's younger sister and would have been Era's sister-in-law. As for Ree, she was apparently Syl's best friend, but there was a bit of a scandal behind this. According to what Lionel had learned, Ree was actually the child between City Lord White, who Aina had killed in her berserk state, and City Lord Kefir, Syl and Anared's father. She was thus treated very well by the family as she was technically a part of them. But Ree herself along with Syl seemed to have no idea about this. Regardless, this was a story that Lionel had thrown to the back of his mind because, truthfully, he simply didn't care. It didn't seem relevant. They are currently both on Earth. Lionel replied lightly. And my father-in-law? Executed. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_G experience, Sarah fell into silence. She should have already guessed this long ago. There was no way that Earth would let the main leaders of the attack live. However, the population of people itself was a different story entirely. They could be slowly integrated and fix Earth's current greatest problem, population. Augustus finally looked toward his daughter, but she was still looking toward Lionel. Earth isn't worried about the two of them seeking revenge for their father? Lionel raised an eyebrow. What would you prefer? Lionel had no way of knowing his grandfather's true intentions. But, if he knew anything about that man, he was prideful to a point and immensely logical when it came to weighing positives and negatives. Emperor Fox had chosen to allow the Paradise Islands to fall from the sky, effectively killing billions of invalids before they could even take form. However, just think about the method he used. The Paradise Islands had been staples of Earth for several decades already. It was so well integrated that it didn't even look like a plot. He was a man who had essentially gotten away with murdering 99% of his people, and it didn't even spark a rebellion. This was to say that Emperor Fox knew how to be cruel to meet his ends, but he was also intelligent in the way he went about it. Killing the city lords was justified. But, if he went as far as to execute two little girls, he would come off as not only a coward, but it would be even more difficult to rein in the people of Terrain to become one with Earth. The risk wasn't worth the reward. Era fell into silence. Soon, it was clear that she had already gotten everything she wanted out of this exchange. You want me to join Earth? Augustus asked. Lionel's armor began to slowly vanish, revealing his real form. At the moment, he was drenched in sweat from head to toe and blood clung to bits and pieces of his body. Yet, when he ran his hand through his wet hair, he seemed oddly dignified and in control. The latest _IP_SODIs are on _the website. No, I want you to join me. Augustus was stunned into silence when he heard this. Was this brat rebelling? On Earth? Wasn't he a prince? What was going on here exactly? Lionel smiled. I'm the only noble in the Empire without a legion of my own. All I have are 8 brothers and sometimes they're not too reliable. What the fuck? Cap, don't lie to the people. Lionel grinned but kept looking toward Augustus. Augustus was baffled at the audacity of this child. He was a 6th-dimensional expert. In fact, he was a genius in his own right. Making it so far in the backwater dregs of this sector was something to boast about without a doubt. Now, a young man who was effectively a child in his eyes, was actually asking him to follow him. If you told Augustus an hour ago that this was how this event would play out, he would have probably killed whoever spoke with a wave of his hand. Do you understand what you're asking right now? Why wouldn't I just leave the Milky Way and go to parts unknown? Why should I wait on you? I wonder. Have you heard of the Morales family? Lionel asked. He gauged Augustus' reaction. Lionel had already deduced that for Shield Cross Stars to act the way it did, it had to be wary of him having a backer. It was possible that the backers it was worried about were those that supported Earth, but if that was the case, why would they have dared to mess with Earth's subdimensional zones? If not for Lionel, the true treasure of Camelot would have ended up in an outsider's hands. The latest _IP_SODIs are on _the website. That meant that what they were worried about weren't the people backing Earth, but rather people that might be backing Lionel himself in particular. And since Era was most definitely responsible for Lionel being framed, it was likely that she had been the one to reach this conclusion first. Simply put, there was a good chance Augustus might be aware. As expected, Augustus' pupils constricted into pinholes, his muscles tightening. It was just for a brief moment, but it would never escape Lionel's notice. I have no idea what you're talking about, Augustus said with a straight face. Lionel's smile didn't fade. Me too, honestly. It's just a random thing I heard people throw out there. But what about this? Lionel's force suddenly surged, 2 pairs of white gold wings spreading out for tens of meters appearing upon his back. Above them, an owl's gaze lingered between reality and illusion, bearing down on the world with an undeniable momentum. The call of a bird rang through the stars, a single flap of its wings bringing 1/10 of light years away. At that instant, the people of the Radix, Midas, Florer, and Umbra families froze in place, their knees trembling. Oh. Luxnix. It was impossible to know who said it first, but they all cowered at once. Not a single one of the invaders didn't recognize the symbol of this sector's rulers. The snowy star owl was a symbol of dominion, of rulership, and of wisdom. Though Aina was currently on the Luxnix main planet, the Luxnix territory spread far beyond that, and it could be said that they had dozens of strongholds across the strongest galaxies of this sector. There was no way a mid-tier 6th dimension family like those here wouldn't recognize them. Augustus gripped his fists tight, his gaze blazing with fire. Visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 1082. The reaction was only as one might expect. The truth was that Lionel hadn't tried to lean on this advantage because he truly felt that it wouldn't matter much to begin with. His ties with the Luxnix and Morales families were loose to say the least. Not only that, but Lionel was a bit stubborn about it all at the same time. He wanted to use his Luxnix and Morales blood for the sake of taking over said families. But, as far as relying on them, he never really had any intention of doing so. As far as he saw things, he would be the one in position to elevate them, not the other way around. And he also wasn't fond of the idea of having to rely on others as well. This wasn't just a matter of pride, it was also a matter of practicality. Just seeing how Aina's family had treated her, Lionel felt it would be a fool's dream to hope that his own families would welcome him with open arms. If he really went into the world with that kind of thought process, he would end up chewed up and spit out before he realized what happened. Lionel had always subconsciously known that his own power and strength would always be the most important. But, seeing how things ended up for Augustus today, and how many times he had been forced to change and alter his plans before he could even take the first step on his journey, he realized it even more now. If he didn't wield enough power and strength himself, it would all be meaningless. There would be a day where no amount of scheming could get him out of a situation and he would be forced to face it head-on. If when that time came he was still trying to play chess when the situation demanded checkers, all his dreams and aspirations would be for naught. Maybe I've been going about this all wrong? Lionel forgot that he was supposed to be waiting for an answer from Augustus for a moment as he lost himself in a trail of thoughts. The latest _sodies are on the website. I'm trying to build a kingdom, but before it's even gotten off its feet it's already pulling me in so many directions. I'm worrying about recruiting, about loyalty, about resources and money. It's diverting my attention so much at just this scale. What would happen on a larger scale? Lionel shook his head. It was difficult to make a choice. In truth, he needed somewhat of a kingdom just to fight for position during the Morales Air Wars. Those individuals probably had far better connections than Lionel could even dream of right this moment. But, if he focused too much on this, his own power would be lacking when the time came. Ultimately, Lionel realized that he once again knew too little. When would the Air Wars take place? What were the rules? Who was allowed to participate at his call and who wasn't? If Lionel could just bring his mother and father with him to the Air Wars, would he even need to worry about victory? If he could do something like that, why was he wasting so much time recruiting people? In that case, wouldn't it be better to just focus on himself and a small group of elites? Then when the time came he could sick his dad's foul mouth on all his enemies and lay back and relax. The latest _sodies are on the website. Though Lionel wasn't exactly sure how powerful his parents were, he assumed they were pretty good. And even though his dad would be against helping him at first, from what Lionel remembered of his mother and his memories, he only needed to ask her once and he would fall in line. Lionel might be against using the Morales and Luxnix family, but he had no qualms about relying on his own parents, even if he had to be a bit shameless about it. These sorts of thoughts were exactly what left Lionel at a bit of a loss. He realized that he was still too overeager and impatient. A dream like uniting the entire dimensional verse was maddening enough, and yet he was actually trying to speed-run it at the same time. He needed to take a breath and calm down. There were more important things to consider. When Lionel reached this conclusion, he finally looked upward again, only to find Augustus looking back toward him with clenched fists and a gaze that was just a little bit too fiery. It was hard to tell if he wanted to tear Lionel limb from limb or kiss him passionately. The oddity was so striking that even Lionel's own expression couldn't help but turn weird. This Augustus was an interesting character? I will follow you, Augustus suddenly said. Lionel blinked. Is that easy? Lionel was stunned. He was used to things going wrong one way or another. Even his own organizations had turned on him more times than he could count by now. It was baffling that anyone would be so straightforward with him. Visit. For the best no underscore vel underscore read underscore ng experience in the end though he grinned. An unknown amount of time later, Lionel appeared within the segmented cube, gasping for breath. His body was aching all over. Truthfully, he felt as though he had just ran 10 marathons back to back to back. He really didn't know what he would do without his vital star force. There's definitely even more potential in Camelot's magic system than just this too. Lionel's mind wandered as he moved through the cube. He eventually made his way to a large training field, just one of several. But at this moment it was a complete mess. Craters littered the ground, large amounts of force hung in the air, making it difficult to breathe, and there were even the dull sounds of struggle still lingering in the air. Lionel stopped looking around to find the head of the Umbra family pincered by vice and candle. He was on his knees, his hand raised up to his sides as though they had been nailed down, when in reality there was nothing there at all. However, the most intriguing part wasn't any of this, but rather the little mink who took the Umbra head's hair as a nest to rest in. 3 more chapters coming later today. The latest underscores are on underscore website. Chapter 1083. Yip. Little Black Star suddenly shot up, springing off of Silem's head and into Lionel's arms. Lionel smiled lightly, chuckling at the little guy's antics. Even after absorbing all of that blood, Little Black Star appeared to be the exact same with no change to his size or his demeanor. But Lionel had a feeling that this was all due to the silver tablet. A few days ago, Lionel realized that if the root of the silver tablet's abilities was to break convention, then didn't that mean it could also shorten the 13 months Little Black Star needed down as well? But Lionel realized then that he had underestimated the silver tablet a bit too much. Not only was it able to cut down the time to a mere fraction of the original 13-month period, but it was also able to help Little Black Star reach a state of perfect integration. What did this mean? It meant that the current Little Black Star wasn't a mutated beast. Even if the foremost experts of the dimensional verse examined the little guy now, they would conclude that he had been born with all the talent he currently had now. This sort of integration was far beyond what even the segmented cube could accomplish with its original 13-month span. This also made Lionel realize another important thing. If the silver tablet could do this for Little Black Star, it meant that it could also do so for himself. His path toward upgrading his snowy star owl lineage factor wasn't as far away as he thought it was initially. Of course, it took Lionel giving up a lot of the resources he traded to the 8-eye branch to accomplish this, but it was more than worth it. Not only would Little Black Star's future be far brighter, but the little guy was now the bane of the Umbra family's existence. The suppression Silem faced was twofold. Not only was his Shadow Fox bloodline suppressed in the face of a stronger beast, but his darkness affinity was practically useless. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Then, on top of that, he actually had to face 2 savants at the same time, one which could reflect all of his clearly weakened attacks and another that could lock him in place or make it near impossible to move with any sort of freedom. Just like that, maybe the most powerful head after Belize fell. The most baffling part was that Lionel hardly raised a hand and ended up killing them both with ease. Even now, Silem could only shake his head. They knew from the beginning that Earth had a high chance of producing savants, but their reports showed that there weren't any. A high chance didn't mean a guarantee, so they had moved forward with that reassurance. Little did they know that Earth had simply hidden it too well. When Terrain attacked Dark Cloud Prison, they hadn't done it with savants in mind, they had only wanted to release talented people with a vendetta against Earth. They were even more clueless about it all than the Umbra and the other families were. The simple truth was that they had underestimated and looked down on Earth too much. Even to the final moment, he had actually jumped headfirst into a trap and delivered himself directly to Lionel. Towards such a thing he could only feel embarrassed. "I don't have anything to tell you, just kill me." Lionel almost couldn't refrain from rolling his eyes. Visit. For a better user experience, is this some sort of third-rate movie? Can't you say something more original than that? Silem's brow furrowed. Movie? What the hell was that? And why did he feel the sudden need to punch Lionel in the nose? Killing you would probably give me the least trouble, but I have a small friendship with Radley, so I thought I would at least try to speak with you first. We have nothing to speak about, Silem said coldly. Nothing? So you don't care about this little mink in my arms that could probably eradicate your entire family on his own just by virtue of his suppressive effect on you all? Silem's brow furrowed. I think I would be fairly justified in going to your Umbra galaxy and wreaking some havoc. After all, your people saw it fit to do that with Earth, right? Silem remained silent, there was simply nothing to say. The two of them simply had vastly different perspectives on things, and Xylem didn't feel that any one of them was wrong. He would just have to trust those who remained to find a way to survive. Well, I could do that. Or I could release you. Visit. For a better user experience, Xylem's expression warped. If he could survive, he would very much like to. Who wouldn't? But right now he just felt like Lionel was just playing with him. Don't be so quick to think him lying. In truth, I have dreams that are quite big and am trying to look into the future. A family like your Umbra family, already well versed in the art of assassination, would be greatly useful to me. My Umbra family doesn't work for others. I know you don't work for others. Ever since you're split from the Three-Finger Cult, right? Xylem's expression changed violently, his gaze snapping up to meet Lionel's. How the hell do you know that? Well, I didn't. Until just now anyway. Lionel smiled and shook his head. Now look, your cliché lines are rubbing off on me. You, the latest _sodies are on the website. Xylem wasn't a fool. He couldn't be goaded into admitting such a thing. The issue was that there shouldn't be anyone who could even take a guess at this to begin with. It was similar to someone being so shockingly and overly specific that it couldn't possibly be that they weren't already certain of the answer. The mere fact that Lionel had asked such a thing meant that he was already at least 90% sure of its possibility. The issue was obvious though. How the hell did Lionel know something like this? Chapter 1084. Xylem was stunned silent, but Lionel only continued to smile lightly. How do you know this? It's quite interesting actually. I was just flipping through the record of the radix. That's impossible. There's no way they would know something so sensitive, or else they would have long since used it. With how precarious their situation against the Flora family has been, it's impossible that they wouldn't have used us to help clear them of their enemy. Xylem was originally a man of few words, but for some reason he found himself spilling in Lionel's presence. He ended up overcorrecting himself and speaking even more than he would have to usually. But that didn't change the fact that he was correct. The Flora family was too powerful and only seemed to steadily grow with every generation. Even with just half of the inheritance of the Silver Empire, the strength they displayed only grew more astounding with every successive generation. In fact, Xylem had reason to believe that the strength they displayed now was just the tip of the iceberg. For whatever reason, the Flora family was very concerned with keeping a low profile. Yet, contrary to that, the Flora family also seemed to be in constant war with the Radix and Midas families. Just on the surface, one could see that there was some sort of secret grudge the two families shared. But as for the details, neither the Umbra, Rain, or any of the other surrounding families had been able to find the truth. This aside, Lionel's stats were perfectly correct. Not only had the Flora won more than half the battles they fought with the Radix, even among the rest, the Radix and Midas still ended up losing all participants in 19% of cases. This was all to say that the Flora were slowly but surely winning the war. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience with the Radix and Midas slowly losing ground, if they had such a trump card, wouldn't they have used it? It simply didn't make much sense. I couldn't help but notice that you didn't react much when I said the name Radleys. Lionel said lightly. Xylem narrowed his gaze but didn't respond. I found your response to be quite interesting because, make no mistake, I was watching intently. I thought that if I mentioned Radleys, there would at least be something. I wouldn't call myself perfect, but if there's one thing I have, it's senses that are quite sharp. However, when I mentioned Radleys, there was absolutely nothing. Your heartbeat was extraordinarily steady, your gaze was placid, and your temperature remained unchanged. It wasn't until a split moment later, when I mentioned potentially sparing you, that you shifted and became cold, outright rejecting my proposal. I found that reaction to be quite fascinating. The odds of a family head like yourself knowing a small figure like Radley should probably be small. The exception would be if he was a member of your family, maybe your son or your grandson, or maybe if he was a great enough genius. I thought that maybe since the like of Radleys, Libley and the others were sent as the vanguard, that they had quite high standings amongst your families. Yet, not once did any of your heads ask for their well-being during our battle or any time before. It made me realize that to you all, these youths were probably a dime a dozen. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, reaching that conclusion, it should be quite obvious then why you didn't react. After all, you don't really know Radleys, isn't it normal? But the answer to that question would actually be no. The normal human reaction to hearing a name they weren't quite familiar with would be inquisition, a bit of processing, memory retrieval, things of that sort. But your reaction was so benign that it was abnormal, don't you think? Xylem's gaze narrowed further. Even now, he was kneeling on the ground, his arms spread outward and nailed seemingly in thin air. I found it odd until I remembered the techniques of your Umbra family. From your records, you're not only adept in the dark elemental force, you're excellent at concealment, you prefer short weapons or throwing weapons, your minds are resistant to mental probing and you're immune to poisons. Paint me a man who's quite fond of his clichés, but isn't that just the perfect character build of an assassin? Your lack of a reaction was a trained response you've honed over the years, correct? It probably makes you impossible to read for most people. Seems you're not most people. Xylem said coldly. Lionel chuckled. Maybe not. But I'm starting to think that I'm not quite normal to begin with. I scare myself sometimes. I wonder just how much of me is a facade I put up to protect myself, and how much of that facade is there to protect others. Visit. For a better user experience, Xylem's pupils constricted. He felt an odd pressure coming from Lionel that made him feel suffocating. A deep fear welled up in his heart, sweat involuntarily pouring down his brows and spine. It felt for a moment that he was before a wild beast. Many people thought that the scariest thing about animals was their strength. Compared to humans, their teeth were sharper, their strikes were stronger, and their propensity for violence was far greater. But, as an assassin, Xylem knew what truly scared most about animals. In a day, humans might interact with dozens to hundreds of their peers. In each one of these reactions, there are clearly learned and easily observable behaviors one can detect. We can sense when someone is uncomfortable, when they're happy, when they're sad, and when they might grow violent. Knowing these things is what helps humans survive. Only by being able to read the intentions of those around you could you maneuver about the world properly. However, many humans couldn't read animals. A normal man could never tell when a snake is happy or sad, or ready to lash out. Their faces were unreadable to the average person, and that was what was so fearsome about them. And right this moment, despite his years of experience, Xylem couldn't read Lionel at all. Visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 1085. Anyway, Lionel continued with a smile, it's obvious to me now that you clearly know of Radlease. Your trained lack of a response likely means that not only do you know him, but that he's also important to you. It's either that he's related to you or that you send him here to do something important. The answer is more than likely both. What I've been baffled about for the longest time, though, is the fact that Radlease would come here and join Valiant Heart Mountain of all places. It never really made much sense to me. The only logical reason I could come up with was maybe that your Umbra family had taken a fancy to the Valiant Heart Mountain's Valiant Pillars? That seemed to be an adequate enough reason. But it simply came with too many holes. With your family's concealment abilities, wouldn't it just be easier to sneak in and snatch the treasure for yourself? What would be the point in sending a young man like Radlease who, at the time, was merely in the fourth dimension? It seems quite counterintuitive and like a grand waste of time. Then there was the fact that Radlease's actions were quite odd in and of themselves. During the first trial for new entries, his performance was good, but it wasn't top tier. He didn't manage to climb very high and was actually outclassed by a few others. Knowing his true talent now, he had clearly been holding back to quite a large extent. After Radlease entered the organization, he seemed to be quite aimless as well, doing nothing much other than chasing girls. There was even a point he joined a crafters guild despite the fact he wasn't a crafter in the slightest. By all measures, it seemed like he wasn't doing much at all. Or maybe that he was rather waiting for something, visit, for the best no_vil_g experience, and that was when the selections rolled around. I missed Radlease's performance due to some reasons. Lionel almost couldn't stop himself from smiling as he remembered the reason he missed Radlease's battle was because he was having his own battle with Aina. But that was neither here nor there. But to my surprise, he actually managed to gain one of the slots to enter the Valiant Heart Zone. To think he had gone from not even being the best among the freshman recruits, to suddenly claiming a place among the seniors. Quite baffling, don't you think? However, you could say that I didn't really have the mind to care about such things. His purpose had nothing to do with me and I was still busy chasing skirts. But that didn't change the fact that he surprised me once again by actually being among the few to survive the entire 2-year period. At this point, though, I didn't really have much of anything, Lionel shrugged. I had a suspicious person but nothing to show for it. Of course, Lionel was lying through his teeth. Even back then, he had already connected Radlease's appearance to the odd ring he had found that day in the mining tunnels and his eventual run-in with the silver tablet in the Valiant Zone. The issue was that he had no real proof. There was no way of him confirming or denying such a thing, and it merely seemed like two coincidences coinciding with one another. Visit. For a better user experience, however, Lionel had already decided that he would be releasing Xylem after today. Once he did, too many things would be out of his control. So, the less Xylem knew, the better. In that case, it was in Lionel's best interest to manipulate the truth behind his deductions a bit and mix in some lies with the truth. Even before a veteran assassin like Xylem, Lionel had no fear about blatantly lying to his face, nor did such a proposition make him nervous. At least, I had nothing to show for it until I read a curious report the Radix had gathered on this galaxy's Valinor family. Xylem's jaw clenched. But even if he wanted to move, he couldn't do so. The Valinor family is quite interesting. According to the people of the Milky Way, they are one of the 3 most powerful families of planet Krars. I've met one of their members before, actually. In fact, she insulted a woman that I quite liked the first time she met her. Her name is Balthorn Valinor. Interestingly enough, when Radlease met her, he was quite enamored by this Balthorn character as well. Of course, Radlease is quite the pervert. He reminds me a lot of my brother Gil, so it seemed to be quite in character for him. After all, Balthorn was quite voluptuous and she wasn't shy about showing off her assets. But finding a report on the Valinor family within the Radix family's records triggered another memory for me. During the freshman trial, there was a battle for golden tags in which I participated. At one point in that battle, dozens of individuals managed to sneak up on me without a single sound, not even alerting me. Visit. For a better user experience, you may not understand how shocking this is, but I certainly did. Back then, I had already awakened the wisdom branch of my Snowy Star Owl lineage factor, so my mind was in the 5th dimension. A 4th-dimensional existence being capable of dodging my detection was quite baffling. Back then, I brushed it off quite easily. I was ignorant and felt it would be ridiculous if there was absolutely nothing that could make me falter. But, as I learned more about the dimensional verse and where I stood within it, I realized more and more how baffling the situation from back then had been. Xylem's brow furrowed. Lionel mentioned the snowy owl was shocking enough for him, but the rest of this? Patience. I know you don't quite understand what the point of me telling you all this is, but I promise it all ties in together. When that group surrounded me and my then partner, I noticed that there was one individual among them that I recognized. In fact, despite her inconspicuous appearance among them, my intuition told me that she was the impetus behind it all. Do you know who she was? Her name was Henorin. And she happened to be the little maid-servant by Balthorn's side, the very same Balthorn your Radlease was enamored with. Visit. For a better user experience, such a powerful concealment type ability, one capable of fooling a 5th-dimensional mind while in the 4th dimension. Sounds quite perfect for an assassin now, isn't it? Chapter 1086. Xylem's breathing became uneven and his pupils couldn't seem to constrict anymore. Each and every one of Lionel's words seemed perfectly measured and dialed in, every syllable controlling the beating of his heart. He couldn't seem to control his body anywhere near as easily as he had done in the past. It all felt quite disconnected and disjointed to me. The Krars, as you can see by how easily Earth handled them in this war, are quite weak. Despite being a powerhouse of this quadrant, the only advantage they really have are numbers. But, many of their territorial planets are still within the 4th dimension while their 5th-dimensional existences simply didn't have the talent to match up to us. But I couldn't help but notice that despite the fact Balthorn and her elder brother were among the greatest talents Krars had to offer, I didn't catch even a glimpse of them during this war. In fact, there wasn't a hint of the Valinor family, at least not on a scale that would make sense for one of the supposed 3 most powerful families of Krars. So, I became intrigued. That was when the Radix family's records fell onto my lap. I guess I really have to thank your 5 heads for trying to deal with us like you had, or else I would have never gotten the information I needed to end all of this so quickly. You might not understand where I'm coming from, so I can explain it. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. When the Radix began their preparation for storming the Milky Way galaxy, they did multiple risk assessments. They were quite well aware that there were many supremely powerful entities eyeing Earth, and they were also aware that it was impossible that these supreme powers wouldn't have made any moves yet. It was easier to believe that those powers were simply still lying low, waiting for an opportune time to strike. In that case, they had probably sunk their roots deep into well-established families. In fact, it might be possible that the reason some of these families and organizations grew powerful in the first place was due to the puppet strings of these hidden powers. So, the Radix did a risk assessment. They began an analysis of all the powers of the Milky Way, big and small, all for the sake of drawing lines around which toes they shouldn't step on. But once again, much like your reaction to Radley's, the cars passed with flying colors and were designated as no risk at all. Quite baffling, don't you think? I thought it was baffling too, until one of Earth's geniuses with a mind-reading ability tried to look into the memories of two princes we had captured, Dee and Dre. Xylem froze, but Lionel's next words made him shudder. No, it was more accurate to say that his laughter did exactly that. He felt like he was being toyed with. Once again there was nothing. Their memories were frighteningly clean. Everything about them was completely orderly, not a thing out of place, not a step out of line. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. At this point my theories were running on fumes. I have no information on anything, no proof of anything, I only have a few anecdotal experiences. But that was when something interesting happened to me. Lionel smiled lightly, scratching the back of little Blackstar's ear. The little one seemed to like that very much, yawning and sticking out his little pink tongue as though he might fall asleep at any point now. You can probably tell by my demeanor that I don't really like leaving loose ends and that I might be meticulous to a fault. Well, a few weeks back I had a battle with the Evergreen religion. They were among the first to set foot on Earth, but we made quick work of them. Unfortunately, one of them managed to escape, and this escape had been nagging at me for a very long time already. Luckily, thanks to the Radix family's risk assessment analysis, the Evergreen religion's main shrine had been marked as a warning zone. Now, I finally knew where this last enemy had likely escaped to, so I went to scout out the situation and hopefully snub any subsequent planned attack before it could even take form. But you'd be surprised to know that not only did I find not a single soul at the shrine, all that was left was a pungent smell of roses and blood. It was the kind of strong scent that could make one either pass out or throw up, but there was a very select few that could bask in it without worries, wearing it as a light fragrance. Visit. For the best no_understood_understanding experience. Xylem trembled fiercely. Even Vice's spatial lock couldn't seem to stop the innate physiological reaction. It seems that you're getting it now, HM? You're better than I was back then because I was baffled. No matter how ignorant I was, I could tell that something very bad happened to this shrine, but I had no way of knowing exactly what that was. Until I cheated a little bit. Lionel flipped his palm over to reveal a small silver disc. I have to say that my father rarely gets serious about anything. He's the kind of man that can turn even his own son's heartbreak into a joke. However, the moment I set the analysis of the little silver disc on that scene just a few days ago, I saw my father get serious for just the third time in my life. A recording flickered and it replayed the image of Lionel's father staring off into the distance in somewhat of a daze. It was clear that when this original clip played, he would have been staring into the shrine of the Evergreen goddess. You ran into this sooner than I thought you would, brat. Remember this scene well, but remember this name even more. The Three-Finger Cult. It's they who are responsible for your grandfather's death. Visit. For the best no_understanding experience. Chapter 1087. Lionel's palm flipped and the rest of the message was cut short. You see, I'm not a very sentimental person. It's very easy for me to not care about things, even if I once cared for them in the past. There are very few things in life that can weigh me without very concrete stipulations being met. However, Lionel's expression darkened, the aura around him growing several levels heavier. It felt to Xylem as though he was within a whirlwind of murderous intent, his heart threatening to leap out from his throat. My father is a man who exists beyond those stipulations for me. His rage is my rage. His sadness is my sadness. His love is my love. To dare to touch my grandfather, a man my father so clearly cares so deeply for. I sentenced this three-finger cult to death the moment I heard its name. Xylem's gaze rolled back, his consciousness almost passing out completely. However, before his mind could go completely blank, Lionel's rage receded like a tide, leaving Xylem like a small boat swaying in the wind. With this new information my father brought me, finding the traces of the three-finger cult was far easier than it was before, and it wasn't long before I realized that as clean as the Valinor family was, they weren't nearly clean enough to escape my deduction. Visit. For a better user experience, the trouble was I had all these loose ends that had yet to be tied together. I had ultimately lucked out in stumbling upon the conclusion, but the road leading to it was still fuzzy and couldn't be quite pieced together. Until, that is, I learned that the three-finger cult had a Shadow Fox bloodline within its ranks. Sorry, I mean the Shadowtail bloodline, right? Xylem couldn't even meet Lionel's gaze any longer. Yes, it was true that they had changed the name of their bloodline from Shadowtail to Shadow Fox. The truth was that their lineage factor had nothing to do with foxes at all. As for the true nature, even Xylem didn't know. This was a truth kept stored away so that the Umbra family would be able to continue hiding away. Of course, Xylem didn't know that Lionel was lying through his teeth. What truly connected all of this for Lionel was actually Senior Lu, the very same poor sap Aina had killed, and Lionel had ultimately gotten the ring that led him to the silver tablet from. When Lionel originally investigated Senior Lu, he didn't find anything special. He was a normal youth and didn't have anything special about him. The only thing of slightest interest was that he was from Krars. Visit. For a better user experience just like this, everything was pieced together. Why would the Three-Finger Cult infiltrate the Krars Empire? Of all powers they could have chosen if not for this reason? Everything began to tie in one after another once this was understood. After managing to hide away from the Three-Finger Cult for so long, the Umbra family definitely had their methods of detecting and avoiding their capture. However, it would also be the case that the Umbra would likely feel that they couldn't simply hide away forever. In this way, the Umbra family was a lot like the Flora family. They were more powerful than they showed on the surface, but they had to continue to maintain a low profile. And, in the case of the Umbra, the only way they could guarantee their survival was by rising up to one day matching the strength of the cult they left behind. Doing so by normal means was impossible. Lionel didn't quite know just how powerful the Three-Finger Cult was, but if it could kill his grandfather and make his father so serious, there was no doubt that he needed to treat it with the utmost respect as well. It was likely then that before separating from this cult for whatever reason, the Umbra family caught wind of some of its plans and chose to get a step ahead of them. With how powerful the silver tablet was, Lionel had no doubt that in the hands of a powerful family, it could cause a qualitative change in their strength given just a single generation. Putting this into perspective, it was no wonder the Umbra would be willing to take this risk. Unfortunately for both parties, the ring landed in Lionel's hand and not theirs. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. If things were reverse engineered from Lionel's perspective, he was able to deduce the connection between the Umbra and the cult by virtue of Radley's reactions. Radley's appearance couldn't have been a coincidence, that was the first flag. Him being so interested in Balthorn was a second flag, it smelled of keeping friends close and enemies closer. Then him finding a way to enter the Valiant Zone despite it exposing his true talent was the third. In the end, there were only two conclusions. Either the Umbra family was a rival of the cult, aiming for the same goal, or they were a piece that had broken off from them that just happened to share the same knowledge on this particular mission. Considering how weak the Umbra family was on the surface, the first option was highly unlikely considering this was a cult Lionel's own father took seriously. In the end, that just left the second deduction. However, Xylem didn't need to know the truth behind how Lionel made these deductions. Any holes in this new chain of reasoning Lionel was presenting could be explained away by saying the silver disc told him. So now, as you can see, Head Umbra, we share the same goal. You need to grow stronger to face the inevitable day the cult finds you, while I want to burn them all to ash. We stand on the same side, don't you think? Lionel's smile remained, but all Xylem could seem to see was a devil in sheep's clothing. Visit. For the best no-understanding experience with all of that out of the way, I'll ask you again. What do you think about me releasing you now? Chapter 1088. Time passed and it wasn't long before Lionel was all alone within the segmented cube. Well, alone if Vice, Candle and Little Blackstar were ignored. As for Xylem, he had left after recollecting himself, realizing that he and his family didn't quite have much of a choice in the matter. Life worked in quite mysterious ways, honestly. Lionel had initially wanted to target the Radix and Midas families in order to complete the Silver Empire's legacy, but he actually ended up gaining the Umbra family instead. Of course, it was a chess piece that he couldn't use quite yet, but it was one nonetheless. Having them would make things interesting. As of right this moment, though, Lionel wasn't really concerned about such matters. Even now, with how real everything had suddenly gotten, it felt like a distant future. Instead, he was spending some time with Little Blackstar, trying to figure out exactly how the little guy had changed. Raising the little mink by his armpits, Lionel looked into Blackstar's deep black eyes. The little mink's long whiskers twitched as though to show his dissatisfaction toward being treated like a baby. Toward this, Lionel could only laugh. You're only 3 or 4 years old this year, right? You're a baby. Yep. Little Blackstar protested. Yep. Lionel, who could feel Blackstar's meaning through their connection, almost choked on air. Did he gain another little pervert for his group? Why was this little guy saying such vulgar things? Look at you being so boastful. What are you so proud about? The both of us are virgins. Visit. For the best no understanding experience. Why? Blackstar tried to claw at Lionel's face, but he only burst into a fit of laughter. Lionel was quite surprised at the little guy's strength though. It was only a casual swipe of the paw, yet the wind pressure made Lionel's face sting a little bit. For Lionel to even feel anything he didn't want to feel was a tall task, considering his body had been forcefully raised to tier 9 recently, let alone for him to feel pain. Yet, not only had little Blackstar done exactly that, the little mink hadn't even tried very hard. With a single look, Lionel could tell that little Blackstar's dimensional grade hadn't budged a single inch. The little guy was still in the first tier of the 5th dimension. And yet, his power had actually undergone such a qualitative change. Lionel's smile beamed. He would have to remember to thank Kira when they met again. He had a feeling that they most definitely would at some point. Little Blackstar hopped up to his favorite perch atop Lionel's head as Lionel himself turned toward Vice and Candle. Thank you two for helping me out. Candle immediately turned flustered. Someone without context might think she was a girl in love, but Lionel knew enough to understand that Candle's mind hadn't even matured enough to give breath to such emotion. She was functionally still a child, as was Vice. In truth, the more time he spent with them, the more guilty he felt treating them like he did. Visit. For a better user experience. Ultimately, no matter what predispositions the two had, they were still human. Locking them away and rearing them like cattle while only releasing them when they were useful to him, it truly didn't sit well with Lionel. Lionel sighed. If he released the reins on them, their power would grow far too quickly. Lionel took a deep breath and looked up into the skies. Finally, he made a decision. I've treated the two of you poorly. You may not understand enough about the world to understand this, but the fact that I know it is enough. I hope to treat you both the same as I do my brothers. I will trust you two so long as you don't give me a reason to doubt you. Candle and Vice both blinked, clearly not quite understanding Lionel's words. Even concepts like freedom and free will were foreign to them, let alone terms like family and brother. However, Lionel had expected as much and chose to take things slowly. He realized at that moment. If he wanted to unite the dimensional verse, was he just going to avoid all the savants to ever be born? There were most definitely powers out there that use savants like their own hidden trump cards. Would he just have to leave those powers alone? Of course not. The latest _sodies are on the website. Was he willing to give up his dream then? After all, how could a normal human possibly defeat a savant? But the answer was the same, of course not. In that case, why was he so scared of the two savants by his side? If he couldn't outpace their growth, if he couldn't subdue them with his own strength, what right did he even have to think of conquering the dimensional verse? Having made such a decision, Lionel suddenly felt lighter. His king's might involuntarily wafted out from him, growing thicker as the color of his pale violet irises deepened before cooling back down to their original shade. Without much hesitation, Lionel reached out into thin air, causing a snow globe to appear in his hands. With a thought, Monkey's body appeared in the training arena, blood beginning to ceaselessly pool out from his wounds. The expressions of Candle and Vice changed. They both remembered this man, though his face was greatly disfigured at the moment. However, before they could understand what it was Lionel was trying to do, Monkey's vocal cords finally healed back into place. The moment they did, an enraged roar shook the segmented cube, causing Lionel to shake his head and sigh. He had wanted to give Monkey a chance at the same deal Vice and Candle gained as well, but it seemed that this wouldn't be possible. I will still give it a shot. Lionel's oppressive aura bore down, locking onto Monkey's every action, however the latter had seemingly grown feral. Before Lionel could understand what was happening, his expression warped. Visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 1089. Monkey began to wither away, his roars growing fainter. Lionel was stunned as he reached forward, but everything happened too quickly. Soon, what was left of Monkey became nothing more than a pile of ash, leaving Lionel absolutely baffled. What the hell just happened here? Little Blackstar jumped into action without waiting for Lionel's command, snagging a shadow out of the air before returning. However, Lionel hardly registered the little guy's actions. Lionel's brow furrowed tightly, his emotions whirling about and his mind in a fog. He had truly wanted to give Monkey a chance, and it was most definitely not his own action that caused the latter to end up like that. Lionel hadn't been shocked that Monkey was roaring in rage. It made sense. The last time they met, he was battling Lionel. If Lionel blamed him for this, it wouldn't have been fair. That was why Lionel was still willing to try and calm him down first. But reality was both cruel and unexpected. Lionel had no idea what could have happened to cause this, but he was left completely in shock, unable to speak a single word for a long while. The reason for this was simple. For the first time in his life, he had no explanation for what was before him. There was no spark in his dreamscape, no small clue he could grasp on, no immaculate God-level deduction to make. There was simply nothing. The snow globe should have preserved Monkey in an absolutely perfect state. The only plausible explanation seemed to be that Monkey had run to the end of his ability and didn't have any more strength to duplicate his cells and heal himself anymore, but the snow globe should have frozen that process entirely. That left only one possibility. Whatever caused this had to have happened before Lionel put Monkey in the snow globe. But this possibility seemed even more impossible than the first. After several minutes, Lionel couldn't find a reason, nor could he find any clues. Without a choice, he closed his eyes, sighing deeply. Someone was toying with him, and he didn't like it one bit. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. This is it, Leo? This thing is disgusting. Alan, aside from being obsessed with a physique he hid beneath baggy clothes, was also the well-known clean freak of the group. Seeing the disgusting tentacle wound before him, despite the fact it was behind a thick wall of glass, he still couldn't help but gag as though he could smell it from here. Lionel chuckled. It's pretty useless the way it is now, but it has potential. You're thinking of using that hell spore on it, huh? I actually don't know quite yet. Remember Little Blackstar's ability? I have something much better for it to absorb now. Alan blinked before he nodded in understanding. Then you want me to? You're probably the only one who's smart enough to manage this. If I leave it to the others, they'll probably find this thing dead by the time I return. Are you calling me dumb, Cap? Where's the workers' union? I want to propose a strike. Franco yelled out in indignation. Alan, however, seemed to hear something completely different. You're leaving? Nope. Lionel shook his head. I actually plan on managing the tentacle wound myself. It's just that I've realized that I've left you all in the dark about too many things until now. In fact, you all don't even know what my goal is, even though you likely know me well enough to have guessed by now. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Lionel suddenly felt a strong arm envelop his shoulder. He looked to the side and up to find Raj's big-faced grin looking back at him. Tell us, Cap. How much of it are we conquering? Lionel saw 8 pairs of eyes looking back at him, each one with their own level of fervor. He couldn't help but grin himself. As expected, it seemed like he didn't have to say a single word. All of it. Lionel strolled through the imperial capital, his steps not very hurried as he looked around. This was probably the first time he came while also having the time to leisurely stroll around. The war couldn't technically be considered over as there were still several skirmishes still ongoing on the border of Earth's territory. But, from what it looked like, it didn't seem that they would be ending anytime soon. Those individuals wouldn't stop until Earth simply grew too powerful for them to even dare. But, with the current state of things, it would definitely take some time before they got there. Lionel eventually made it to the Imperial Palace and the guards were still as stiff as they always were. But, Lionel just ignored them as he usually did. The difference was that this time, none of them reached out to stop him. At the large, arching doorways, Lionel's uncle Galerin already stood waiting, still wearing his spectacles as always. This man always seemed to be quite rigid. You're on time. Galerin spoke. Though his voice was quite even, he seemed to have been trying to convey surprise. Clearly he didn't expect this out of Lionel. Lionel raised an eyebrow. Punctuality is the foundation of any man. Galerin's brows shot up this time. He looked toward Lionel deeply, a hint of something else in his eye. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. I heard that you're on better terms with my son? Lionel grinned. Are you scared it'll steal him away from the Empire? Cheeky. Galerin stopped himself, realizing he was sinking into Lionel's rhythm. This was something that usually only happened to him when he spoke with his father or when he spoke with his brother-in-law. To think. Galerin shook his head. Come with me. Soon, the pair had entered a familiar garden and Lionel laid eyes on a man who was now much younger than he remembered him. But he didn't think much of it. There were probably odd twists and turns around this that he wasn't quite aware of and didn't quite matter for now. Emperor Fox opened his eyes and looked Lionel up and down. The two remained in silence for a long while before he spoke. Not bad. You're not bad either. Lionel replied. Too bad you're a mass murderer. Galeron's brow furrowed, but Emperor Fox just laughed. I have a feeling that the blood on your hands will be much denser than mine when all is said and done. That is the difference between a king and an emperor. You can't escape that reality. Lionel's gaze narrowed, but he remained silent. This aside, your mother has contacted me. Visit. For the best no_Shinji experience, she's waiting for you and Noah on planet Luxnix. Feel free to go over whenever. I have to say, I'm quite eager to watch this play out. Chapter 1090? Lionel didn't react immediately to this news. On the inside he was quite excited to see his mother. But, on the other hand, he had several questions he wanted to know the answer of first. The first and most obvious was why his mother had left him in the first place. There were too many things about his family dynamics that he couldn't quite grasp. First, there was the oddity of the fact he hadn't even known Emperor Fox was his grandfather until just a few years ago. Of course, Lionel knew that that was somewhat related to his status as someone who should have been imprisoned in Dark Cloud Prison, but that only made things more confusing to him. Was he really such a menace to society? Just how accurate was that test if it could only possibly read a fraction of his real DNA? But then there was the question of just how Earth's empire had become tied to one of the three leading families of this sector. How had his grandfather even met his grandmother to begin with? How had their relationship even taken root? His grandfather was maybe the greatest mystery of all of this. On first inspection he seemed to be weak. After all, he had gotten old. From what Lionel knew, there had only ever been one emperor of the Ascension Empire, and that was this man before him. Thanks to Earth's technology, or what seemed like it, he had been able to live for more than 200 years, making it to the 25th century. However, things didn't really add up. He had enough strength to slap a fifth-dimensional existence like Scythe to death years ago, yet he couldn't maintain his youth? Visit. For the best no_Shinji experience, several small inconsistencies like these made Lionel shake his head. Practically, a weak man would never be able to win over a woman from a sixth-dimensional family. Unless... Lionel looked his grandfather up and down. Are you a drafted son-in-law? Galeron choked on air. He bent over, gasping and wheezing. A drafted son-in-law was probably the most humiliating position a man could be in. It was a situation where instead of a wife marrying into her husband's family and sharing his family name, the vice versa occurred. In this case, the man would take on the wife's family name and become a part of her family. Traditionally speaking, it was always the son's duty to carry on the family name while it was the daughter's duty to birth the lineage of the man she married. Even with how progressive 25th century Earth had become, this was still the default order of things. To insinuate the Emperor of Earth was a drafted son-in-law was an insult probably only short of saying the Ascension Empire would fall. Even the guards hidden in the surroundings, tasked with protecting Emperor Fox's safety, couldn't help but falter. Lionel, though, felt that it was plausible. Maybe the Luxnix wanted a piece of Earth but couldn't get it through normal means due to various reasons. This could have been a compromise between them and Emperor Fox. Who knows? Maybe it's because of the secret help of the Luxnix that his grandfather was able to rise to power. Visit. For the best no_Shinji experience on top of this, the help of the Luxnix would become very important very soon. As quickly as Earth had managed to enter the fifth dimension, they would likely speed run into the sixth as well. In that sort of situation, without the backing of a well-established and powerful sixth-dimensional power, Earth's luck would finally run out. The higher the dimension, the harder it was for talent to bridge the gap. If his grandfather made such a sacrifice, it would seem like truly the most logical decision. For the first time, Emperor Fox was truly speechless. He gazed at Lionel as though trying to gauge something, but in the end he just shook his head. I would teach you a lesson for that mouth of yours, but then your mother would start nagging me again. Emperor Fox continued to shake his head. I plan to tell you some things, but since you want to be so cheeky, how about you go find out for yourself? Lionel's placid expression spread into a smile. Sure, but where are my rewards? Rewards? Emperor Fox smoothed out his immaculately sculpted beard. For what, exactly? Now it was Lionel's turn to be speechless. Did one have to be thick-skinned to be an emperor? Hey uncle. Are you hearing this? Visit. For the best no_Shinji experience, Galeron, who was still choking on his own air, coughed lightly, straightening out his back. His eyes flickered as he remembered Lionel's teasing words from earlier. Hear what? He asked with as straight a face as possible. I see how is. I guess he'll just have to tell the whole of Earth just how ungrateful Emperor Fox is. I'm currently a hero of heroes, I'm sure there'll be plenty of people willing to heed my call. Lionel cleared his voice as though he would truly begin to opine on his hardships. Both Emperor Fox and Galarin remained silent, light smiles tugging at their lips. It was clear that they weren't afraid of Lionel in the slightest. Plus, it wasn't as if anyone would hear anything even if he began shouting here. This was the Emperor's private garden, as if sound could casually travel outward. Seeing their lack of a reaction, Lionel realized that his tactic wouldn't work, at least not as presently constructed. Oh, I see. Got it. Lionel's smile became thinner. I guess when I see my mother for the first time in over a decade, and her heart is overflowing with warmth and the motherly instinct to protect, he'll just have to let her know that her father and her brother have taken advantage of her son. While her precious baby was on the front lines putting his life on the line, they were resting in a cozy palace doing visit. For the best no-underserved experience moments later, Lionel walked out of the palace with a wide grin on his face, tossing a 12-sided star pendant up and down, his visage the picture of satisfaction. Just one more chapter coming for today. Chapter 1091. Imperial Father, you. Galarin looked toward where Lionel had vanished with a complicated look in his eye. This pair of grandson and grandfather really didn't like to take any losses. At this moment he actually felt a little bit bad for Lionel. If things had gone normally, Lionel might have still gotten a little something out of them. But this was a little bit much. Emperor Fox, after making sure that Lionel was gone, burst into a fit of laughter. He laughed harder than he had in a very long time, what remained of his wrinkles seemingly fading away with every peal of laughter. It took several moments for him to calm down, his move having been lifted by several levels. Who asked that brat to be so cheeky? Since he wanted a reward, I gave him a reward. But, Galaran's gaze flickered. The reward Lionel had gotten was a pendant of the Luxnix family. It was one you received for granting a great service to the family and held just as much, if not more, weight that the imperial pendant Lionel had received from his grandfather in the past. The difference here was that one granted you the favor of a world like Earth that was ultimately still weak. However, the other granted you the favor of a family at the very pinnacle of the sixth dimension. Ultimately, the vaults of the latter were far more valuable. At least on the surface anyway. Visit. For a better user experience, the star pendant, when exchanged with the Luxnix family, would give one the ability to freely pick out a treasure from the Luxnix family treasury. The ability to pick out a single reward might seem stingy, but the truth was exactly very much the opposite of this. As one of the three most powerful families of the sector, the treasures the Luxnix had monopolized were beyond one's wildest imaginations, at least from the lens of a fifth-dimensional world and below. Even in the eyes of many sixth-dimensional existences as well. But it was exactly because of this that the snowy star pendant was more like a ticking time bomb than a reward. It only made it worse that the reward was originally given to Emperor Fox to begin with. Emperor Fox was dying of laughter because he could already imagine Lionel's face when he realized that his reward wouldn't be so easy to cash in. What are you so worried about? Eleanor is there. It was only after hearing this that Galarin realized that things would be all right, and it allowed him to settle down the weight on his heart. It seemed that he had long since given up on his own mother's backbone. Only in this way could he feel that his son would be safe. As for Lionel, that cheeky brat could use a few beatings. However, there was one thing still weighing on Galarin. Imperial Father. The service you rendered to earn that pendant? Emperor Fox waved a hand. I don't need a single thing from that family. They can consider themselves lucky that I haven't razed them to the ground yet. The latest _AP_SODIES are on _the website. Galarin fell into silence as Emperor Fox closed his eyes. A gentle wind passed by, washing the weight of their words away. Lionel had no idea that his grandfather had still had a trick up his sleeve. Currently he was still blind about a lot of things and wasn't even aware, just yet, that the Luxnix family estate was potentially hostile ground. Oblivious, Lionel rounded up his brothers and contacted Noah. It wasn't long before the group of them had set off to a journey across the stars. In a somewhat unexpected twist, Lionel ended up taking more people along than he thought would be involved to begin with. It wasn't just Noah, but he also brought along Jessica. Along with the two of them, several other talents of Earth including the people of the Moon followed along as well. In fact, there was even Arthur's son Leonis. It hadn't been long since Lionel saw Leonis as they had fought together on Earth X1, but in an odd twist of fate Lionel ended up being closer to Leonis' father and his big sister by several decades than he was to Leonis himself despite their ages being so close. The world worked in odd ways indeed. Seeing so many people, Lionel realized that he was definitely missing a large piece of this story. Whatever was going on at Planet Luxnix was definitely far more important than it seemed. He thought he was just going to see his mother. But things clearly weren't so simple. Still, Lionel welcomed them all with open arms. Since they were headed to a sixth-dimensional world, there would definitely be a lot of chances to grow stronger. Why wouldn't he want the people of Earth to benefit from this? After learning about the Three-Finger Cult, Lionel realized that there were far more claws sunk into not just the Milky Way but the dimensional verse as a whole. None of them had the luxury of growing up slowly. Visit. For a better user experience as was natural, the men and women split and the rowdiness of Lionel's brothers came into full effect. Noah, who was clearly not used to such situation, stood out like a sore thumb. No really, I was a fan. Karelish tried to hide a bit of his embarrassment. It's just that we didn't tend toward playing football on the moon because our bones are more fragile than yours. We were too prone to injury. So I could only watch. Milan burst into a fit of laughter. You hear that, Cap? I have a fanboy. Who's a fan of you? I've never heard of someone tripping over themselves to praise a position as boring as yours. Raj snapped. Clearly he's infatuated with my elegant blocking. Piss off. There's nothing elegant about people crashing into that jiggling stomach of yours. It's called insulation, you uncultured swine. In the eyes of Mother Nature, I have an evolutionary advantage over you. Good luck in the long, cold winters. The rowdiness of the group only grew as the days passed. Not long later, the rotating orbit of 3 planets that couldn't have been more different from one another appeared before them. However, it was difficult to enjoy the beautiful sights at all because the densely packed starways of spaceships clogged up the view. What the fuck? Raj exclaimed. There's traffic in space too? Visit. For the best no_vil_it_ng experience. Chapter 1092. The sight was a bit overwhelming. To many of the youths here, the wider dimensional verse was still new to them. Back on Earth, before the metamorphosis, though technology had been very high level, space exploration was still something that had numerous sanctions and holds. Something like seeing a large army of spaceships was beyond their scope of experiences. It only made things worse that of all the galaxies in this sector, the Milky Way was practically considered to be bumpkin country. There were many planets, worlds and organizations that remained fairly restricted and rarely allowed interplanetary travel. The population of spacecraft owners was a small enough percentage of the larger picture that this was the very first time any of them had seen such a scene, including Lionel. This being the first time they were in such a situation, even Lionel felt at a loss for a moment. But after quickly analyzing the situation, he grasped a general understanding. The starways were essentially just motes of light that guided the spacecrafts toward their destinations. It was hard to tell exactly which to choose, not because Lionel couldn't tell which roads went where, but rather because each of the planets had hundreds of starways to choose from. The trouble was that Lionel only knew which of the 3 planets was Planet Luxnix. He didn't really have any other information. Without a choice, he could only pick out a random starway and follow it, falling into line along with everyone else. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. While the segmented cube was in a state of cruising, it was no issue for everyone to be within the same region. Lionel, who was still monitoring the overall situation, almost didn't notice that after Raj's initial outburst, the atmosphere had become quite silent. Lionel took his gaze away from the starway and swept it over everyone. At the moment, they were all in a dining room of the abode setting, supposed to be enjoying a cross of the beautiful scenery of space, camaraderie and the food spread. However, instead of this, many of them had furrowed brows. Some had more serious expressions than others and some were clearly more comfortable, but there was no doubt that the vast majority seemed to be going through an adjustment period. The only one who didn't seem affected at all was Lionel's cousin, Noah. But then again, his face was always that serious, so it was hard to tell. It was only then that Lionel remembered that they had just stepped through a 5th-dimensional fold to enter a 6th-dimensional one. At the same time, the pressure here was far beyond any normal 6th-dimensional fold of reality. If it was normal, why would 3 such powerful families be forced to share it together? Logic dictated that they had probably warred over this region in the past and ended up settling for ruling over it together when neither could get an upper hand. As such, It wasn't a large leap to believe that this was the most beneficial location of this sector to all three families. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience seeing through the issue, Lionel chose to slow the segmented cube even further, allowing everyone the time they needed to get acclimated properly. If they didn't even feel comfortable in their own bodies, whatever danger they may or may not face would only become all the more so. Lionel, who had still never experienced such a dissonance upon entering a higher dimension, could only believe that it must have to do with his parents. Noah's lack of a reaction would seem to back this up as well. To Noah, coming to Luxnix should have been no different from returning to Earth. Both worlds should recognize him as one of their own. Due to the slowing of the place, it took the group several hours before they finally approached the planet. But the good news was that everyone's furrowed brows seemed to have relaxed immensely by this point and the banter seemed to have come back. It seems that there are some fast-track starways around too. I don't feel very comfortable claiming to be a Luxnix before I understand the situation of the family first, so it might not be too good to use them for now, but I'll keep it in mind for the future. Lionel was too used to entering and leaving planets on a whim. He hadn't even realized that this was a product of just how far behind the Milky Way was in comparison to other galaxies in the sector. He would definitely have to be more thoughtful in the future, lest he stir up trouble he wouldn't be able to handle. At that moment, the segmented cube rumbled, touching down through planet Luxnix's atmosphere. The slight shake caused everyone's gaze to light up. It seemed that they would finally touch down soon. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, the speed of the spacecrafts accelerated, swooping down and finding a familiar large hive of parking spaces. It was only at that moment that Lionel realized another problem. He didn't like the idea of leaving the segmented cube parked here. It was far too important to him. But at the same time, it was kind of odd to swoop down in a spaceship that suddenly vanished as well, especially considering how it seemed bureaucracy would get involved very soon. Once again, the simplest thing to do seemed to be to rely on the Luxnix family name. He would even have the pendant to prove it if somehow his own lineage factor wasn't enough. But the idea once again didn't sound very palatable to Lionel. Before Lionel could come to a decision, his segmented cube was led to a hub of the spacecraft hive. From the outside, it had once again taken the form of a cube, but this wasn't too surprising to anyone as there were all sorts of odd spaceship designs all around. When Aina had touched down with Yuri and Savon, her father had been waiting. Unfortunately for Lionel, when he touched down rather than finding his mother, he found a middle-aged man with glasses riding his high-bridged nose, wearing a tight suit and holding what looked like a clipboard made of transparent glass. The latest _IP_SODIs are on _the website. He stared coldly at the cube, clearly waiting for someone to step out. Lionel stood to go, but he surprisingly found Noah's hand on his shoulder. "I'll go." Chapter 1093. Lionel found Noah's actions to be amusing. It was clear that Noah was a lot more sensitive to trouble Lionel might cause if he went instead, so he chose to bite the bullet. Towards such a thing, Lionel's 8 brothers laughed until they couldn't breathe anymore. "Look at that, Cap, someone else notices all the trouble you put us through." Franco almost fell out his chair. "If anyone was going to cause us trouble, it'd be that big mouth of yours." Lionel snapped back. "Not cool, Cap, poking at your boy's insecurities. No wonder Noah doesn't trust you." Franco feigned hurt, his overly large hands also pressing against his chest. But no one could take him seriously while he was wheezing with laughter. Since he seemed to be having such a great time, Lionel kicked at the leg of his chair, causing him to truly fall over completely. "I swear I'll make a workers' union. By then you won't be able to bully me anymore." The laughter in the dining room continued for a while. However, as the minutes passed, it became clear that it was actually taking Noah quite a while. In fact, it wasn't until half an hour later that he finally returned, his expression just as placid as ever. "Visit. For a better user experience, what happened, Noah?" Everyone looked over. They might have been able to tell a problem or the good news by another's expression. But Noah was truly too difficult to read. "There's a lot to do because we've brought so many people along with us. However, it seems that due to some special event occurring, the restrictions on travelers has been laxed. That said, there's still a bunch of requirements we have to meet. We all have to register and it's fairly detailed." Noah began to pass out what everyone assumed would facilitate the registration process. But when they all saw just how detailed the analysis had to be, they couldn't help but frown. It had to be remembered that in the dimensional verse, the less information others had of you, the easier it was for you to protect yourself. But this form of analysis was clearly overly invasive, It even required information about their ability indexes, something most kept as close to the vest as possible. They couldn't help but feel that planet Luxnix was taking advantage of them all. Lionel, though, saw one step deeper. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. There were so many spacecrafts flying into planet Luxnix, and now Noah was mentioning this special event. Connecting the dots, it felt like the Luxnix were using this opportunity to form a census of the people of their sector. Lionel couldn't be surprised if this information was used to gain a general understanding of the strength of the sector. Unfortunately, they didn't really have much of a choice. At least that was what it seemed like until Noah continued talking. After speaking with our overseer, I realized that there was a bit of a loophole here. Because Lionel and I both carry Luxnix blood, I believe we'll be recognized as members of the Luxnix branch families. So long as you all register as our vassals, it should be possible to circumvent a lot of the more invasive questions and leave them with only a surface-level understanding of you all. But the decision is up to you all. Oh, since it's like that, why didn't you just say so? You made it sound like I'd have to give up my precious cherry? Raj exclaimed. Several weird looks were sent over toward Raj, their expressions warping. Precious cherry? What are you all looking at? My body is a temple. Raj's speech was so impassioned that the jiggles of his chin vibrated to their own rhythm. Unfortunately for him, his opining was matched with the sound of dry heaving. Visit. For a better user experience, I think I'm gonna throw up. Hey Franco, cup your hands together for me real quick. Gil heaved, only to be met by a slap to the back of the head by none other than Franco himself. Noah blinked as he watched this scene, feeling somewhat stunned. He had presented this matter with the utmost seriousness because it most definitely wasn't a joke. It might have sounded nice to explain it away with a word like vassal, but the ultimate truth was that for the duration of their stay on planet Luxnix, they would essentially be at the whims of Lionel and Noah. There were no such thing as human rights in the dimensional verse, there was only those with strength and those without, those with background and those without. If they signed up in this fashion, their lives and deaths would be in the hands of the two of them. The amount of trust it would take for someone to take such measures without hesitation. Noah's expression remained placid, but he couldn't help but be moved. Unlike many princes, he had never experienced the cruelty of nobility, not personally anyway. The Fox family had never had internal machinations, at least not at the highest levels. So, things like brothers backstabbing brothers wasn't part of Noah's lived experience. That said, Noah's upbringing had still been extremely strict and he had seen exactly this sort of cruelty in the royal court and other noble families countless times. He always followed the rules to their ends, but he was also perfectly aware that he couldn't expect everyone to be like him either. On top of this, due to Noah's status, he didn't really know what it felt like to have real friends either. He didn't get the chance to grow up with his cousin by his side, and everyone else was either his subordinate or someone who wanted to get close to him for the sake of the power he wielded. Understanding Noah's perspective, it was no wonder he was so shocked right now. At the very least, Lionel's 8 brothers didn't hesitate in the slightest to jump headfirst into acceptance. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_understingy experience, Leonis looked toward Noah with a knowing smile. Of all those here, he probably had experienced the life most like Noah. It seemed that they both had some growing to do. Chapter 1094. An hour later, the overseer returned to the parking hub, but his stoic expression could only be replaced with shock. He looked around, but he couldn't seem to find the spacecraft that had been here anywhere. Where? Did they leave? No, that's impossible. The overseer's brow furrowed. Maybe it's a concealment formation? Those are pretty popular these days. Checking his glass clipboard, the overseer saw that this party was led by 2 Luxnix branch family members. In fact, judging by the density of their blood, they should be ranked quite highly amongst the branches as well. So, he was more than willing to overlook some things. That wasn't the only reason the overseer was impressed either. They actually brought more than 50 people along with them. Any branch with this density of talents is definitely very highly rated. It's best that I know my place and don't pry into their business too much. After nodding to himself, the overseer opened a hidden panel to the side and pressed a few buttons. Soon, the parking hive screen began to descend, moving just slowly enough for the overseer to slip out and move toward the next waiting group. Visit. For a better user experience, the horde of Earth's talents had had dreams of living it up on this new planet and finally exploring a 6th-dimensional world for the first time. Unfortunately, reality was like a cruel slap in the face. Fuck. We're so poor. Gil was by far the most heartbroken. He could only look at the pretty women through the large glass windows, knowing that he didn't have the money he needed to even take a single step in. They were all swiftly met with the disparity between fifth and sixth dimensional worlds. There wasn't a restaurant, a boutique, or even an inn in sight that didn't use sixth dimensional herb or as the common denomination. In fact, Planet Luxnix preferred the use of a purple coin that was recognized throughout the three families. You could exchange herb or for these coins, but it took 10 kilograms of sixth dimensional herb or to exchange for a since purple coin. The only sixth dimension herb or Lionel had on hand came from what he plundered from Belize, Averone, Dolores and Cirrus, but they could only be considered mid-level sixth-dimensional powerhouses. Even between the four of them, Lionel only managed to gather 50,000 kilograms, which was only enough for 5,000 purple coins. Even the lowest prices Lionel had seen just casually glancing through these windows had cost dozens of purple coins. He most definitely couldn't support more than 50 people to experience this planet in leisure. In fact, with how things were going, they might have to sleep in the wilderness tonight. Luckily, before things got that bad, Noah came to the rescue. Visit. For the best no_vel_id_ng experience, there are some special accommodations for Luxnix family branch members that we can go to. I didn't think that we'd need them so soon. But judging by the situation, Noah blushed slightly. Clearly he was a bit off on his assessment of his own wealth as well. Lionel couldn't help but laugh seeing Noah's state. It was rare to see him shift from his baseline coldness. He couldn't help but wrap his arm around his shoulder. That old codger is too stingy. Lionel sighed and shook his head. Noah choked on air. Old codger? You mean grandfather? But Noah didn't know how to react. He had never heard anyone say such things about his grandfather before. But then again, he was Lionel's grandfather too. What was the appropriate response to this? Noah suddenly found that he didn't have a diplomatic solution to this at all, but that only made Lionel laugh harder. Come, since we're so poor, we might as well check out these accommodations. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Lionel felt that they didn't really have a choice. He didn't really want to rely on the Luxnix without understanding the situation. But, technically, both Noah and Lionel were actually members of the main branch. After all, his grandmother should be an elder of the main branch, so her lineage would of course receive like treatment. So, technically, Lionel was already taking several steps back by only accepting the accommodation of a branch family member. That said, Lionel obviously had no idea that his name was stricken from the family records. If he had known this, his attitude wouldn't have been nearly as casual. The accommodations for the branch family members of the Luxnix were truly not bad. Though it wasn't near the Luxnix family estate, it had its own unique character. Well, as much character as a series of enormous buildings could have. Just at a single glance, it was possible to tell that the Luxnix had set aside a series of luxury hotels for their extended family members. The only unfortunate part was that the congestion at the front made everything that much harder to appreciate. Do you know who I am? I'm heading the younger generation of the Nipso branch. We've contributed so much to the main branch over the years, now you want to give us such normal accommodations. Piss off? What fucking Nipso branch? I've never seen your names in even the top 10 of the branch contribution rankings. What have you been doing? Conquering little fifth-dimensional worlds? Maybe you aren't even doing that. Are you taking their moons and calling it a day? What right do you have to a penthouse suite? There are only 10 of them. How about you go take a look in the mirror? The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. You haven't seen us in the top 10? Do you need your eyes checked? I've seen your Conlon branch barely holding on at the 12th spot. Maybe your eyes can't look up so high. Imagine looking at the daily rankings and thinking you're something special. We of the Nipso branch only care about the yearly rankings. It's just that we've taken some time off recently to prepare for this event. Arguments of a similar nature seemed to be erupting all around as swarms of people fought back and forth. But it was quite obvious at first glance to Lionel that while they were rowdy, none of them had stepped over the red ropes that separated them from the experts waiting to assign their rooms. However, these experts didn't seem to be willing to make a move either. What a shit show. Lionel was speechless. Chapter 1095. The ruckus had reached such a ridiculous level that no one even really noticed the arrival of as many as 50 people. That was more than enough to paint the picture of not only just how large the group was to begin with, but how invested they were in causing trouble. Just from eavesdropping a few arguments, Lionel was able to tell what the main issue was. There were several large hotel-style buildings up ahead. These hotels were surrounded by lush gardens, various sports fields, dining regions and other places of leisure. But it seemed that the most hotly contested regions were within the hotels themselves. There were exactly 10 of these hotel buildings and it seemed like each family was scrambling for a penthouse suite. The problem was not just that there were more than 10 branch families, but a single penthouse could only room so many people to begin with. Just by counting the windows from the outside and judging by the height and thickness of the buildings, Lionel realized that the problem was more than just the penthouse and it seemed that many hadn't realized this just yet. There were 10 hotels and by Lionel's calculations, each had about 200 rooms. If the average was taken, each room could probably house between 2 to 3 people. Even if Lionel chose the upper limit, that was still only room for about 6,000 people. And if Lionel was honest, it was likely closer to 5,000. The trouble was that this crowd seemed to already have thousands of people in it. And this obviously didn't count whatever groups had arrived earlier than them all. After all, Lionel hadn't exactly left Earth on a timely schedule, so it was a bit much to expect that they would have been the first batch of arrivals. Visit. For a better user experience, that meant that there was a good chance that many of the rooms had already been accounted for, yet these people were out here screaming like this would do something. There are screaming matches not only between branches, but there's even competition and internal struggle within branches themselves. Lionel shook his head. As far as he was concerned, this was a matter of life and death for himself and those he had brought with him. While they had joked about sleeping in the wilderness earlier, on a pinnacle sixth-dimensional world like this one, there was no telling what kind of dangers lay outside the breadth of the protected cities. Even now, the segmented cube couldn't be considered to be a fort and it was very susceptible to being penetrated from the outside. It was relatively safer in a weaker dimensional world as it had entered its third phase. But, now that it was in a world of equivalent status, what advantage it had once had was now null. Lionel cast a glance toward Noah and they both seemed to have come to the same conclusion. Quickly scanning the crowd, Lionel couldn't seem to find a way through. At the same time, there didn't seem to be any signs directing them in what to do, there was only a line of red rope blocking their further advancement. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. The two didn't act rashly. They could tell that there were plenty in the crowd who had also fallen silent, realizing their rowdiness wouldn't get them anywhere. Lionel initially wanted to ask for normal rooms, making it clear he would give up a fight for the penthouses for the sake of those around him, but he felt like if such a decision was possible, others would have made it already. There was something decidedly off about the current circumstances and it felt more like people were waiting for a signal or a time of some sort. Understanding the situation that they were in, Lionel instead began to slowly analyze those around him. Now that he was in a sixth-dimensional world, he no longer dared to just casually release his internal sight as he did in the past, but the hit on his senses wasn't too profound. No one here is about the fifth dimension, but there are several well into the middle tiers. Lionel's expressions turned serious. He didn't dare to take fifth-dimensional existences above himself casually now. This was no longer the Milky Way or its surrounding galaxies. The power and talent of these people was on an entirely different level. The young man hollering about the Nipso branch had 3 silent youths to his back. In fact, he was the weakest of them all. He was tier 5, however of the 3 youths to his back, 2 were tier 6 and 1 was tier 7. The Conlon branch was comparable in strength. Likewise, the young man yelling was just tier 5, but there were 2 tier 6 existences to his back and 1 tier 7. Visit. For a better user experience right now, these 2 groups seemed to be the most powerful, but Lionel had found a silent young woman who stood almost completely by her lonesome. Her hair colored a red-gold flare and her jaw was quite strong. Despite this, she still managed to keep her feminine charm. It only took a glance for Lionel to realize that she was actually tier 8. Seemingly feeling Lionel's gaze, the young woman turned her head, her twinkling irises matching Lionel. She looked him up and down without reserve before looking away. It seemed that she hadn't found anything particularly special. Right then, the silent overseers looked up into the sky. Seemingly deciding something, they chose to step forward. In the middle of them, a youth with sweeping white hair and piercing golden eyes took the helm. The aura he exuded seemed to silence any and all before him. Despite the fact he was only tier 4, he commanded an aura of absolute obedience and dominance. Today 50 rooms will be up for claiming. 30 will be 3-person rooms. 20 will be 2-person rooms. 9 will be 1-person rooms. 1 will be a penthouse suite. The rules will be the same as they've been. Only those with 0. 10 bloodline density and above can participate. You may fight for one or multiple rooms depending on your ability. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscore experience, those who will participate step forward now. Chapter 1096. 0. 10 bloodline density? Lionel's gaze narrowed. He wasn't familiar with this form of measurement. But since things were like this, he had no choice but to hope he met the mark. He should be fine, but there was no real certainty. If things worked like they did on Earth, then Lionel would probably have 25% of whatever DNA would make a Luxnix be considered to be purebred. But something told Lionel that the lineage factors of the dimensional verse function differently. At the very least, he hoped Noah could meet the mark and claim a few rooms for them. The moment the youth spoke these words, several had ugly expressions, and this even included the 2 Tier 5 youths who had been the loudest of the bunch. Soon, those who knew they would never make it began to move away from the red ropes, knowing their place. They don't meet the mark? But it seems they aren't moving away. Are they going to try their luck? This told Lionel one very simple thing. This bloodline density could be changed. If they were certain that it couldn't, they wouldn't even bother. You guys can take a step back as well. Noah and I've got this. Lionel gave the youths of Earth a reassuring grin. Even if it was hopeless, he would have to find a way to make it hopeful. He was only Tier 1 now, a far cry from the other participants, but he didn't have much of a choice but to make sure this worked out. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscore experience soon, there were only a few dozen people left of the thousands that had been at the ropes. Everyone else had given them a wide space at the base of the first hotel. There were hundreds of meters worth of perfectly paved stones in every which direction, making a single person seem particularly small. The Tier 4 youth representing the Luxnix took out a crystal ball he was forced to hold with 2 hands. It was a size larger than a normal human head and perfectly rounded. It was quite a beautiful construction. Its appearance seemed to remind Lionel of Camelot's crystal balls as well. It had been a long time since he thought of them, but he remembered being fascinated about just how they stored information. Maybe there's a lot more to Camelot's magic system that I've been ignoring. I wonder if it's possible to deduce the path of evolution their technology would have taken over time as well. As Lionel was lost in thought, the Tier 5 Nipso branch member stepped forward, seemingly wanting to get it over and done with as soon as possible. Compared to his previously rambunctious self, he seemed to become especially timid after crossing the red ropes to the other side. It was almost as though the difference between himself and the youths before him was palpable despite the fact he was technically a tier above the young man before him. The Tier 5 youth pressed his hand down on the sphere and took a deep breath. Then, his body erupted with a white gold force, filling the crystal ball to the brim in the blink of an eye. The youth quickly removed his hand and took a step back, watching the crystal ball with anticipation and his fists clenched. Soon, a pillar of light rose out from the crystal ball. Visit. For a better user experience, it shot past 1 and 2 feet quickly, blasting through 5 feet and soon crossing 7. However, the moment it reached that height, it began to slow considerably, barely crossing past 8 as it struggled forward. The forehead of the youth became covered in sweat, his hands clutching so tightly that even the blood he drew couldn't find a path to drip to the ground. The pillar rose past 9 feet finally, but every subsequent inch felt like scratching and clawing. Eventually, after rising up just 8 more inches, 4 from the 10-foot mark, it came to a grinding halt and released a pulse of light. 0.0967. Failed. The youth deflated in an instant, but he didn't protest. He knew better than to do something so foolish. At the very least, so long as his companions won an extra room, he would be priority in claiming it. 0.0963. Failed. The Tier 5 Conlin youth failed soon afterward. One after another, youths just barely missed the mark, whittling down the few dozen that had stayed behind to less than even a single dozen total. It was quite depressing to see one individual after another just barely miss the mark, but this was only to be expected. Only those who were close to begin with would even dare to take this test. At that moment, one of the Tier 6 Nipso branch youths stepped forward, carrying a level of confidence the others hadn't had. He bowed lightly in greeting to the 3 main branch youths. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Clyde Luxnix. He introduced himself. Not wasting any more time, he placed his hand on the crystal ball and his force surged. Before he even got a chance to step back, the pillar of light shot upward, beginning to climb faster and faster. This time, unlike it had with the others, the pillar didn't seem to slow in the slightest, bursting through 8, 9 and even 10 feet in the blink of an eye. 11 feet. Whoa. The pillar didn't begin to slow until the light crossed 15 feet. Soon it crossed 16 before it slowed to a crawl and finally came to a grinding halt. 0, 16:23. Past. Clyde's face lit up. Clearly he was very much impressed with his own performance and felt like he was on cloud 9. However, he was soon hit with the reality that the youths before him didn't seem to care about his performance in the slightest. In fact, one of them, seeing how excited he was, couldn't help but turn a look of disdain his way. Clyde's excitement very quickly became embarrassment. Without a choice, he scurried back, unwilling to humiliate himself any further. The latest _IP_SODIes are on _the website. Soon, the second Tier 6 member of the Nipso branch stepped forward, their expression much more reserved after seeing what happened to their companion. All of them became keenly aware at that moment that they were nothing more than ants in the eyes of the main branch youths. Chapter 1097. 0. 1783. Past. 0. 1812. Past. 0. 1405. Past. The youths who came next no longer bothered to introduce themselves, the shame of Clyde still burned fiercely into their minds. None of them wanted to suffer through the same humiliation. Even without speaking a single word, these youths had made them feel as though they were less than trash. And yet, they could only clench their fists in silence, enduring. Lionel watched on without saying a word, his arms crossed about his chest. To his side, Noah stood just as expressionlessly. A slow building of an oppressive aura rose around the two of them as neither seemed to be willing to make a move. As far as they were concerned, what they did wouldn't matter much. In the case that their bloodline density was enough to impress these three youths, then there would be no real point in doing anything. Their action would only reinforce the disdain these youths had for those of low bloodline density. Visit. For the best no_vil_ed_sng experience in the case that their bloodline density didn't meet the mark and they fought against these youths, they would only be shooting themselves in the foot. They had no money and nowhere else to go, and this world was too dangerous to be taken casually. It was one thing if they only had to take care of themselves, but they had the safety of more than 50 other individuals to cover for. The young woman with red gold hair couldn't help but look over toward Lionel and Noah. Their auras were quite reserved, but she was a lot closer to them than the main branch youths were. As such, it was far easier for her to pick up on it. Her lips couldn't help but curl into a smile. The good was that they actually dared to still have a temper before these three youths. But the bad was far worse. What good was a temper if you were too weak to do anything about it? With a smile still tugging at her lips, she stepped forward. Raya Sage. She was the very first to introduce herself after Clyde. No, it was more accurate to say that she was the only one who dared to introduce herself after Clyde's humiliation. And what was even more astonishing was that her last name wasn't Luxnix. Clearly she had taken her father's name. The boldness of this Raya girl couldn't be understated in the slightest. The Sage family was one only second to the Luxnix, Viola and Montex families. As such, it wasn't a humiliation for a woman of the Luxnix to marry into their family. The trouble was, if Raya had the support of the Sage family, why would she come here? Visit. For a better user experience, the only explanation was that she hadn't come for the sake of gaining a place of accommodation. She had come for no other reason than to test the Luxnix youths. She wasn't very interested in these regular branch members. She was far more intrigued with the youths in the penthouse, so she thought that she would claim one for herself. As for what the youths before her thought of that, she didn't really care. Technically, she was indeed a member of the Luxnix branch families. Without waiting for a response, she too put her hand on the crystal ball, her force surging. Her palm had hardly touched the smooth glass when the hidden force within stirred, waking up like slumbering dragons. The call of a bird cawed through the skies. In one moment there was no pillar at all, and in the next, a beam of light over 30 feet tall manifested, still rocketing upward. The youth holding the crystal narrowed his gaze. The 30-foot mark demarcated a bloodline density of 0. 30. That was already enough to match the lower-ranked members of the main branch. Every 10 feet could be considered a watershed moment. It was already impressive enough to cross the first watershed as a member of a branch family. Beyond 20 feet and you could be considered a rare find among these branch families. These were individuals the main branch entrusted with tasks of great importance like managing valuable disaster worlds and other similar resources. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_ng experience, the 30-foot mark, though, was the baseline for being nurtured by the main branch. If such a youth was born in one of their branch families, so long as their background was clean and didn't involve any scandals, like bastard children and the like, they would be entered into the main family records. If one managed to cross the 40-foot mark, though, the pillar trembled, crossing the 39-foot mark before it finally began to slow down. As though it had met firm resistance, it pulsed wildly. However, ultimately, it couldn't cross the next threshold, finding itself stuck and unable to move on. Tisk, Raya shook her head. Shame a shame. 3989. The youth holding the crystal ball narrowed his gaze. This bloodline density was beyond his own, yet she didn't even share the Luxnix family name. Inwardly he was more than just a small bit infuriated. However, with such bloodline density while being at tier 8, it was clear and obvious to him that he stood no chance against this woman. In addition, there was a good chance that since she chose the Sage family name despite having such thick Luxnix blood, that she was actually an extremely rare dual lineage factor wielder. Those that could maintain 2 high bloodline densities at a time were geniuses among geniuses. He didn't dare to mess with this girl whether her name was Luxnix or not. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_ng experience, Lionel smiled lightly as he watched this scene. But he still had no reference for how impressive this mark was, so he only watched on as Noah was forced to follow it up. In the end, there were only the two of them left. There wasn't much of a choice. Noah's expression carried not a hint of fluctuations as he stepped forward. Raya couldn't help but raise her brows. She had gone up before the two of them on purpose after seeing their obstinance, eager to see if their egos were just for show or not. But who knew that they wouldn't have reacted at all? However, her intrigue soon turned to shock the moment Noah placed his palm down. Chapter 1098. The cry was so loud that many were forced to cover their ears. What once had been a pillar of light for everyone else became a bird soaring into the skies, every flap of its wings covered 10 feet without fail as it rose up. Raya's eyes widened when the bird tore through the 40-foot mark. Unlike Lionel and Noah, she knew exactly what this meant, as did the 3 youths of the main branch. Their expressions couldn't help but change. Bloodline density sounded like a very loose term, but there were actually very stringent markers to meet. These markers were designated by the number of lineage factor talents you had awakened and what depth you had in each one of their branches. The Snowy Star Owl lineage factor had 3 main branches: speed, wisdom, and healing. Whether it was 0, 10, 0, 20 or even 0, 30, none guaranteed you an awakening of any one of these. These densities essentially decided what level of affinity you would have for Snowforce. If the metrics of Valiant Heart Mountain were used, 0. 10 would be about 3rd grade affinity, 0. 20 would be 6th grade, and finally, 0. 30 would be 8th grade, while nearing 0. 40 would give you 9th grade. It had to be remembered that this was affinity for a very particular light elemental force and snow force. This wasn't the same as having a general light elemental affinity. Having 9th grade affinity for snow force was much different from having 9th grade affinity for light elemental force in general. However, 0. 40 was a different beast entirely. To have 0. 40 bloodline density meant that you had awakened at least one of the 3 main branches. This didn't just make you a genius, it made you one the Luxnix would nurture with everything they had. To awaken a branch of the Snowy Star Owl lineage factor while not having reached the 6th dimension yet was a rarity among rarities even in the main branch. The Tier 4 youth could count on both hands and feet the number of youths who met this mark, and that was in spite of the fact there were millions of members of the main branch and billions of the side branches. Seeing Noah cross the 40-foot mark, how could they not be shocked into silence? Lionel's gaze scanned the reactions of those around. When he saw how they were reacting, his lip curled into a smile. It seems that his cousin wasn't bad indeed. But what no one expected was for Noah's Snowy Star Owl illusion to continue, crossing the 50-foot mark before it even thought of slowing down. Visit. For a better user experience, the hands of the youth holding the crystal ball trembled. In the younger generation of the Luxnix family, there were only 3 youths who could cross the 50-foot mark. Actually, there were 4, but the 4th was such a lofty existence all to his own that everyone subconsciously set him apart from the others despite the fact he was technically a lot younger than most of them. Noah looked up into the skies, just as expressionlessly as always. His emerald irises reflected the light but no real emotion. Unfortunately, the youths of Earth wouldn't allow him to continue acting cool. The sounds of whistling matched the call of the bird in the sky. Show them who's boss, Noah. Raj took off his shirt and revealed his temple to the world, waving it in the air like a pumped-up cheerleader. Whether by coincidence or not, the flapping folds of his fat matched the flaps of the illusory bird as it hovered in the air, looking down on everyone proudly. The cheering of Raj and the others tested the thickness of Noah's face. He could only pretend as though he didn't hear anything so that he could scurry off to the side. Lionel burst into laughter, walking forward and patting Noah's shoulder. The bird in the skies didn't seem to want to disperse. It was probably possible to spot it from several kilometers away. At the very least, those in the city most definitely all saw it and couldn't help but look toward it in awe. Soon, the snowy star owl began to disperse, motes of light dancing about the air as they faded. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. The Tier 4 youth looked toward Noah with a narrowed gaze. Unlike Raya, Noah hadn't introduced himself. This made things kind of weird. Who are you? Which branch do you come from? Something like this had to be reported without a doubt. It likely wouldn't be long before this spread far and wide. How had such a talent not been brought into the main branch already? My name is Noah Fox. I don't come from any named branch family. The Tier 4 youth's brow furrowed. A bastard child? This conclusion was very likely. With how the dimensional verse worked, there were likely no shortage of illegitimate children out there for several Luxnix family elders. This made the situation very complicated. If Noah was the bastard child of a Star Order elder, it would be even more troublesome as it was a scandal the family wouldn't like at all. Purity was especially important for the Luxnix. The Tier 4 youth could only hope to end this all as quickly as possible so that he could go back to report this. He looked toward Lionel, a hint of impatience in his eye. However, seeing how close Noah and Lionel seemed to be, he didn't dare to be too dismissive at the same time. Lionel smiled lightly and took a step forward, placing his palm on the crystal. The difference was simply too striking. Whether it had been Noah or Raya, both gained a reaction that was instantaneous even without the deployment of their snow force. However, for Lionel there was absolute silence. It made those around think that his result would be just as benign as those that came before Raya. Visit. For the best no_NG experience, but reality was very much different. In complete silence, the illusion of a snowy star owl appeared to Lionel's back. Its sharp gaze lingered in silence as everyone paid attention to the crystal ball. None seemed to notice that change until it was far too late. The crystal began to glow slowly. So slowly that it was agonizing. However, there was a difference between this time and any other time before it. The Tier 4 youth felt that his palms were melting. Crack. The sound was jarring, shaking many out of their lull. It was only then that the pair of eyes to Lionel's back seemed to enter their vision. Somehow, no matter whether you were facing Lionel's front or back, the pair continued to pierce through your very soul. The call of the bird followed, but it was neither loud nor grating. Rather, it became a sonorous call that touched the heart, filling every inch of planet Luxnix. There was not a single soul who didn't hear it. Right then, the crystal ball burst apart, releasing a blinding light that shot into the skies and pierced the clouds above. It continued for such a long and sweeping distance that it even tore a path out of planet Luxnix's atmosphere, presenting a sight that could be seen even from planet Viola and Montex. Visit. For a better user experience in a particular garden, an old woman slowly rocking her chair of white wood looked into the skies. Her glazed-over gaze trembled slightly, her heart skipping a beat. She didn't need to be there to know that it was her grandson. Both of them. Chapter 1099. Lionel looked up into the skies. Even with the second stage of his wisdom branch activated, he couldn't see to the end of it. Of course, this so-called second stage were the eyes of the snowy star owl. In fact, Lionel had reached the second stage of both his wisdom branch and speed branch long ago. The star path that appeared when he hit his top speed was exactly the second stage of the speed branch and his white-gold illusory wings. The only branch Lionel was still at the first stage for was the healing branch of his snowy star owl lineage factor, and it could only be used once every several months. It was precisely because these things had come so easily to Lionel that he wasn't aware of how he compared to the others of the Luxnix family. In fact, he took these awakened talents for granted so much so that he rarely used them in battle, often choosing to rely on his ability index much more than other things. This wasn't entirely Lionel's fault, though. Lionel expected for his snowy star owl lineage factor to be like his metal synergy lineage factor. Lionel could squeeze out so much more power from his metal synergy lineage factor. As such, when he didn't receive comparable results from his snowy star owl lineage factor, he thought that the problem was that his lineage factor was too weak. Due to this, Lionel actually began plotting how to strengthen a lineage factor that could already be considered to be at the very pinnacle of what the sixth dimension could offer. It could be said that if the others of the Luxnix family were aware of his thoughts, they would hate him more than they already did. Visit. For a better user experience, the truth was that the snowy star owl lineage factor wasn't weak. In fact, it was far from it. It could even be said that there were some lower-level 7th-dimensional families that couldn't compare to it. The main issue was that Lionel didn't have the appropriate techniques to pair with it, as such he could only display a fraction of what his true strength should be. It had to be remembered that the snowy star owl lineage factor was greatly reliant on one's affinity for snow force. However, what good was an affinity for a force if you didn't have the proper medium to make use of it? To put things into proper perspective, one needed to understand a few things. Firstly, the snowy star owl lineage factor worked differently from the Morales family's metal synergy lineage factor. The truth was that it was far less structured and systematic. To most of the Luxnix family, the talents of the snowy star owl couldn't be accessed until entering the 6th dimension. Only a rare few geniuses could awaken some branches before reaching this level. Before then, they mostly relied on their snow force affinity. As a powerful 6th-dimensional force, snow force stood at the pinnacle of most light elemental forces at this level. In the past, Lionel had dismissed snow force because he hardly considered it to be top 100 amongst light elemental forces, and it was hardly top 1000 among star elemental forces. What he didn't know was that such rankings were astoundingly good. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. How wide was the universe? How many families were there? How many different types of forces? To be ranked so highly on a list that was nearly infinite. If that wasn't excellent, then what could be? This advantage alone separated the Luxnix from other 6th-dimensional families. Though it wasn't enough to be treated with the utmost respect by that mysterious organization, the mere fact they had produced nominal students in the past was enough to show just how talented the people of their family was. Yet, even then, upon entering the 6th dimension, people of the Luxnix would undergo a qualitative change. They would begin to awaken their branch talents, and their strength would explode forth by leaps and bounds. The most astounding of the Luxnix would awaken their branch talents to the 2nd layer. These were the individuals that would become potential heirs, Star Order Elders, and 8-point and 12-point Feathersword Warriors. Somehow, despite not even touching the 6th dimension, Lionel had awoken the 2nd layer of 2 branches already, another shocking feat in its own right. Many of the best geniuses of the Luxnix would only ever awaken a single branch talent in their lifetimes. Noah shook his head as he looked up into the skies. I guess there went any chance they had of keeping a low profile. Unlike Lionel, Noah was aware of many more things. He knew exactly the kind of trouble this would bring. Visit. For a better user experience, he knew about Lionel's temper and had been trying to find a way to ease into the discussion eventually, since obviously, this had been thrusted onto his shoulders by his father and grandfather, but it seemed he wouldn't have the chance to be delicate about it all any longer. Sensing Noah's gaze, Lionel looked over and grinned. Not bad, right? Noah was speechless. Why did this cousin of his only seem to smile so brightly when there was trouble on the horizon? The Tier 4 youth holding onto the crystal ball stood speechless. Even as the lights in the skies slowly dimmed and the crystal ball finally shattered in his hand, crumbling to the ground, he still didn't quite know how to react. Every fiber of his being wanted to say that it was fake, that the crystal ball was faulty. But he knew better than to say something so foolish. The only way for the bloodline density tester to react in this way was if the bloodline was considered to be perfect. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. The only way to bring the snowy star owl lineage factor to perfection was by awakening one of the branches to the 2nd layer. But there was only one other person in the younger generation who had done this while still in the 5th dimension. Chapter 1100. We need to report this. The Tier 4 youth snapped out of his daze, realizing just how big this matter was. Galfin, we still haven't. A youth behind Galfin spoke out. They were meant to hand out 50 rooms a day until all of them were given away. They couldn't exactly shirk their responsibilities, right? Galfin's expression flickered, but he made a decision. This is more important. We need to go now. Well, move this back to another day. We have to hurry. Galthin turned to dash away. His two companions turned to leave as well, but they suddenly heard the sound of someone clearing his throat. "Are you three really just going to leave like that?" Galthin's steps froze and he turned back, his brows tightly furrowed into a frown. He was a member of the main branch, no matter what Lionel's bloodline density was. Wasn't he being a bit too liberal with his words? The simple truth was that Lionel looked nothing like a person with a high density of Luxnix blood should. His skin was several shades too tanned, his hair was a nice shade of violet, but it definitely wasn't the same white or gold one would expect from a Luxnix, nor was it anywhere near as bright. By all rights, Noah looked far more like a Luxnix if you overlooked his emerald eyes. Due to these reasons, he hadn't expected much from Lionel to begin with, but now that he was calling out to him so casually, his suppressed displeasure was threatening to bubble forth. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. In the end though, Galthin managed to control his emotions. Regardless of what Lionel looked like, the test wouldn't lie. And knowing the family, he would likely be drafted into the main branch very quickly. In that case, Lionel's standing would be far superior to his own. There was no need to offend him for no reason. "Do you need something?" Galthin asked as neutrally as possible. Lionel smiled lightly, pretending not to see through Galthin's internal struggle. "I and my companions are a bit poor. If we don't find a place to stay now, I'm afraid that we'll have to return to our home. By then, things might get a bit inconvenient for you." Galthin's expression flickered again. He couldn't decide whether Lionel was shameless or if he should be disdainful. What the hell was this? Clearly, Lionel was trying to get himself some free room and board using his newfound status. Forget it, it doesn't matter. If he enters the main branch, the room he claims will end up empty and it'll be the same result no matter what. They'll just give him the keys, he'll end up returning it anyway. "How many rooms do you need?" Lionel's gaze flashed as he finished the calculations. "I need 12 three-person and 11 two-person rooms." Galthin's brow twitched. But he could already see that Lionel was trying to take a step back by not asking for the penthouse. In that case, it could be seen that he really needed these rooms. "All right here." Galthin tossed a spatial ring over. "As for everyone else, please come back tomorrow. Visit." For a better user experience without waiting to hear the cries of discontent, Galthin scurried away, leaving Lionel with a smile on his face. Lionel's gaze flickered when he noticed that Raya had appeared before him. Without hiding the curiosity in her gaze, she looked him up and down as though trying to understand something. "You two are related?" she asked. Lionel tilted his head. "He's my cousin." Raya's gaze lit with curiosity. For two young men related to one another to have such high bloodline densities, it most definitely wasn't a coincidence. It was more likely than not that both were tied to the same scandal. At that moment, everyone from Earth surrounded Lionel and Noah again, their expressions beaming as they hoisted the two into the air. Or rather, tried to. "What the hell, Cap? Why are you so heavy?" Lionel laughed. His weight didn't bother him in the slightest, he didn't even feel that it slowed his agility or speed at all. However, the same couldn't be said for others. In the end, they hoisted Noah up beneath his protest and kicked Lionel to the side entirely. Raya watched on with a curious light in her eye. Who were these people exactly? They seemed quite close. Visit. For a better user experience, Galthin and his two companions rushed toward their aircrafts. As members of the Luxnix family main branch, they had permits others would have to leap through countless hurdles to get, allowing them to fly their own crafts outside the designated starways. With their speed, they'd be able to return to the family estate in just a few hours. However, the three of them could have never expected to find the most beautiful woman they had ever seen waiting for them. None remembered what happened. But later that day when they returned to the estate, they reported none of what occurred, almost as if they had forgotten entirely. Sitting on the clouds with a leisurely smile on her face, Eleanor's delicate features tinged with a red excitement as she enjoyed the simplicity of watching over her son. She hadn't felt so fulfilled in a very long time, but eventually she sighed. "Mom has wronged you, little lion, but I need to do so one more time. This will be the last chance I give your grandmother. As a mother, my priority will always be your safety, however I don't want to live in a world where my son and my own mother cannot speak to one another. So be patient with Mom, we will meet soon." Eleanor's expression flickered with a complicated light, but soon her smile returned as she watched her son interact with his friends. Her joy bubbled forth again as she could hardly contain it. Later that night, as the sun set, Lionel was pleasantly surprised to find the penthouse key in the spatial ring. He simply assumed that Galthin was trying to curry favor with him and had no idea that it was his own mother who couldn't stand the idea of her son having anything less than the best. If Lionel knew that his mother had actually managed to secretly put something in the spatial ring without him even noticing, he would quickly realize just how large the disparity between himself and true experts was. However, Lionel didn't think much of it because when he entered the penthouse, he found something waiting for him on the massive bed. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. This. Chapter 1101. When Eleanor saw Lionel notice the things she left behind, her smile beamed. She giggled foolishly in the skies as though she was a young girl again. Lionel blinked when he saw what was on the bed because even without touching it, he felt that it was all far too valuable. A part of him believed for a moment that this might have been in every penthouse suite, but something within him said that that should be impossible. Would the Luxniks really give so much to a branch family member? Lionel's brows furrowed, suddenly remembering the state the Radix family's wealth had left him in. Just one casual fort they had built used up enough herb ore to bury the Milky Way. Could it be another case of this? However, such thoughts were swept away in just a few moments. The Luxniks shouldn't know anything about Lionel yet, but these items felt too personal. Lionel took a step forward, not having the mind to care about the luxury around him. He climbed the small set of steps covered in lush carpets that led to the enormous bed, reaching out and grabbing the first crystal ball he saw. As though sensing Lionel's touch, the crystal ball gently burst into sparkling motes of light, releasing the item within. When it landed in Lionel's hand, he almost fell over. Despite his strength, the item was so heavy that just holding it up made him feel as though his biceps would tear. Luckily, seemingly sensing his weakness, the item sparkled, its weight becoming instantaneously lower. In fact, it suddenly felt as light as a feather in Lionel's hands. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. In the skies, Eleanor blinked in shock before her eyes bloomed into crescent moons from smiling so wildly. That damn thing actually recognized my little lion from a single touch. Ah, my son is so talented. The wind around Eleanor seemed to respond to her laughter, vibrating as though the space itself would collapse. But, by some sort of magic, all the turbulence vanished just a few meters from her. Lionel looked at the bow in his hand, his gaze sparkling. This is a gold-grade weapon. No, it's not just gold-grade, it's tier 9 gold-grade. There's just no way. Silver was the hallmark of the 6th dimension. Gold-grade meant that this was a 7th-dimensional weapon. If Lionel was unsure before, he was now completely certain that it was impossible for the Luxniks to have been the ones to leave these things behind. He looked up and around, but he really couldn't sense anything. Even after analyzing the room again and again, he couldn't find a single thing out of place. If that person left even a single strand of hair, Lionel would have been able to find it with his current abilities. And yet, he couldn't pick up on even that. Was it Mom? Lionel blinked. That seems to be the only explanation, but why didn't she come to see me? Visit. For a better user experience seeing Lionel looking around and scanning, Eleanor felt her heart leap into her throat. She clutched her hands over her chest, pressing down firmly. It seemed to take all the strength she had in her body not to dash down there and embrace her son. Look at you. You've gotten so big. Seeing that he couldn't find anything, Lionel turned his attention back to the bow. It was without a doubt the most beautiful weapon he had ever seen, and it was most definitely the largest bow he had ever laid eyes on. From tip to tip, the bow was 3 meters long. Its string grooves were fashioned into the heads of 2 white-maned lions with shimmering rubies for eyes, while its body was embroidered gold and white gold. Finally, its bow string itself glistened like it was woven of crystal fibers, twinkling even in the non-invasive light of the penthouse suite. Lionel couldn't help but raise the bow up and pull at its string. He had expected to not be able to move it even an inch. Back when Lionel first ran into Merlin's bow in the Camelot zone, it had only been a quasi-bronze bow, and yet despite the strength of his body at the time, he could only pull it to 10%. With this being a gold-grade bow, a tier 9 one at that, Lionel fully expected to not move it a single centimeter. If he could move it at all, he would feel shocked instead. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. And yet, to his surprise, not only did he move the bowstring before he even realized what was happening, he had pulled it to 100%. A wild pressure circulated about the room. Lionel felt that the level 3 bow force that had been such a drain to accumulate in the past swirled around him as though it was on a leash. In fact, Lionel felt that even if he had to release dozens of such powerful arrows, he could do so now. Wow! Lionel's gaze lit up. This bow was beyond his expectations. Such an ability frightened even himself. Just based on a change in equipment, he was actually suddenly so much more powerful. And Lionel felt that this was likely just the tip of the iceberg when it came to this bow. Maybe he couldn't use its full abilities just yet because it was purposely lowering itself to his level. Lionel had no idea that as shocked as he was, his own mother was quite speechless. Enlightened bow force? While in the fifth dimension. If Eleanor had been laughing before, she was practically gasping for air now. Even over at that place, her son would be near the very top just based on this alone. Those bow enthusiast old fogies would be fighting tooth and nail for him. The latest _AP_SODIs are on _the website. Realizing that he was maybe causing too much of a commotion, Lionel slowly released his grip on the bowstring, looking at the bow with a hardly contained fondness in his eye. He didn't know how freely he would be able to use this bow. After all, a seventh-dimensional treasure was far too valuable. Who knew how many people would try to kill him just to lay a hand on it? But it couldn't be denied that this gift was extraordinary. After a while, Lionel finally managed to peel his eyes from it and store the bow away. But when he touched the next crystal ball and saw its contents, his gaze widened. Chapter 1102. The oars fell into a beautiful pile on the soft bed. For a very long time, Lionel couldn't bring himself to move or even breathe. He had to double and triple check that he was seeing correctly, and with his thinking speed he actually ended up checking several hundred times before he realized that it all wasn't an illusion. Evolution Oregon. Not just any evolution ore, but both fifth-dimensional and sixth-dimensional evolution Oregon. Of the former there were actually 20 essences worth. For the latter there were exactly 10, the minimum amount Lionel needed. This was why Lionel had felt that these gifts were simply far too personal. Evolution ore was exactly what he needed to form the foundation of his divine armors if he wanted to continue following his father's crazy plan. It had to be remembered that the divine armor Lionel was wearing right now was still fourth-dimensional. The reason it could display so much strength within the fifth dimension was precisely because Lionel had used evolution ore as its foundation. The trouble with this approach, though, was the difficulty in finding evolution Oregon. Even after all this time, he had yet to catch the faintest clue about fifth-dimensional evolution Oregon. But now, he suddenly had all he would need for his next two divine armors. Toward such a turn of events, Lionel could only be speechless. He knew that even for a seventh-dimensional existence, these two gifts shouldn't have been so easy to get one's hands on. In fact, it wouldn't really be an exaggeration to say that it was near impossible. Visit. For a better user experience a Tier 9 gold grade bow. Sixth-dimensional evolution ore. How could Lionel not be shocked? Even with his limited scope of the dimensional verse, he knew just how valuable these things were. Lionel couldn't help but look around again. But even with all the giggling of his mother, he couldn't detect her at all. Without a choice, he could only store these ores away as well. Now, he just needed to find the core piece of his next divine armor, then he could start designing it. Lionel had already planned to use the snowy star pendant to exchange for the core of his fifth-dimensional divine armor. Now he was even more determined to do so. Lionel moved on to the next crystal ball, but this time he braced himself. If he got shocked to the point of silence every time, he might very well be here forever. The next crystal ball burst into motes of light and crystals, revealing a delicately embroidered pouch. It alternated in deep blacks and gently glowing golds. When Lionel opened it up, he found that it was actually a spatial treasure. Within it, he not only found billions of purple coins, there were even billions of kilograms of sixth-dimensional herb ore and millions of kilograms of seventh-dimensional herb Oregon visit. For a better user experience, it was safe to say that Lionel had never seen such wealth concentrated in one place. It only confirmed just how low his previous bounty was. He really was just a petty criminal. Of course, this wasn't exactly true. Tier 4 fugitives don't just fall out of thin air. The main reason Lionel's bounty was so low was because he was still technically a galaxy-level criminal. As such, his bounty was tied to the Milky Way, which was a poor corner of the universe. This was only to be expected. Still, in one moment, Lionel had been poor. And in the next, he could be considered to be one of, if not the wealthiest man on planet Luxnix. The difference was so striking that he almost experienced a bit of whiplash. With this, there were only 2 crystal balls left. Lionel stepped toward the second-to-last one, allowing it to shatter just like all the other ones had. However, unlike what Lionel had come to expect, there was actually another crystal ball waiting for him on the other side of this one. Curious, Lionel sank his mind into it, only to be bombarded with all sorts of information. At first it was a bit overwhelming until Lionel pulled back. He had gotten into the habit of wielding his internal sight like a sledgehammer because he could usually take in everything at once. But clearly this was too much information even for him. Visit. For the best no_underscored_understanding experience. Once Lionel did so, his eyes practically shot out lasers of their own. Techniques. Thousands of them. And each and every one related to Snow Force and the Snowy Star Owl lineage factor. There were third-dimensional, fourth-dimensional, fifth-dimensional and even sixth-dimensional techniques all in one place. There were techniques designed for those who hadn't awakened any branches whatsoever, and other techniques designed for those who had awakened one or even multiple branches at a time. It was as though the entire history of the Luxnix family's advancements were all painted in this singular crystal ball, and Lionel had a feeling that if the Luxnix were aware of this, they would have been pissed off to an extreme. Lionel suddenly realized that the difference separating his combat prowess and that of the top geniuses of this sector was in his hands. These gifts were definitely all carefully selected for him. They were exactly what he needed. Lionel stored the crystal ball for now and moved on to the final one. When it shattered, he found that there was yet another crystal ball waiting for him. In fact, within he found more techniques. However, these techniques were far different from the Luxnix family techniques. In fact, they were designed not for the Luxnix but rather the Fox. Lionel's brow shot up. Visit. For the best no_underscored_understanding experience, there were only a handful of techniques, but each was uniquely curated. Each taught how to apply the Fox family lineage factor in cooperation with your strengths. If Lionel was correct, these techniques were likely personally designed and created by his mother. Only she could have all these unique combinations of powers. The first of the techniques Lionel seemed to gravitate toward made his heart tremble. Chapter 1103. Whether by coincidence or just a well-timed stroke of fate, the unmutated form of the Fox family lineage factor was actually called Emperor's Might, the perfect mirror of Lionel's King's Might. Just from a casual introduction, Emperor's Might functioned on the backs of your subjects and those who believed in you. It was an intangible sort of belief system that relied on how those around you viewed you. Despite not being an empress herself, Lionel's mother had great fame in the dimensional verse even though her own son was oblivious to it all. That said, even if she didn't, Alienor was a bit of a special case due to her world spirit. By virtue of the fact she was chosen by Earth's world spirit, it was accurate to say that the life of Earth's population was tied to her. As such, even in comparison to Emperor Fox himself, Alianor's Emperor's Might was on another level entirely. All of this said, after several months of observation, Lionel's King's Might wasn't exactly the same, though the power itself presented very similarly. The first difference was that Lionel felt that he had the ability to share his King's Might with his companions. Emperor's Might could not do this. The second difference was that Lionel's King's Might partially relied on his subjects, however it gained no boost from how others viewed him or his legend. Instead, Lionel's King's Might seemed to feed off of Lionel's personal mental state rather than the mental state of others. Visit. For a better user experience, these differences aside, the application of Emperor's and King's Might were exactly the same, and Lionel didn't believe that there would be a problem in applying them to these techniques. But Lionel was more interested in hearing exactly what was so special about this lineage factor. Luckily, his mother didn't disappoint him. So that's how it is. I see. Lionel had partially guessed it, but he hadn't quite grasped the full picture. Both Emperor's and King's Might were actually a derivative of Dream Force. In fact, they touched on a barrier that only savants could reach, falling just short of that penultimate height. Lionel, the Dark Cloud Prison who had assumed the place of Lionel, had the ability to use his Dream Force to manifest his thoughts into reality. Using Emperor's Might and King's Might, you wouldn't be able to go so far, but you were able to use your consciousness to affect change in your surroundings. Reading this sort of introduction, Lionel felt enlightened. The latest _SODIs are on the website. When he had exited the Valiant Heart Zone, his hair had still been impossible to cut even with the increase in his strength. It was only by instinctively using his King's Might coercion that what once was near indestructible hair became as fragile as paper. In fact, when Lionel brought his metal body to Tier 9 of the 5th dimension, his hair had grown out wildly again and he was forced to cut it using this same method once more. Lionel never really thought much of it before, but this explanation made so many things click into place. It was no wonder why fusing his king's might into his domains made them so much stronger. He felt as though these simple words were opening up enormous doorways to him. Learning that his king's might was an extension of his dream force made Lionel feel as though he had finally grasped onto something that had always been constantly slipping through his fingers. He felt much lighter and far more confident now. When he finally turned his attention back to, it felt like it was made for him. In fact, he felt like all of these techniques were made for him. It fused the piercing gaze of the snowy star owl with Emperor's might, forming a level of sensory perception that internal sight alone couldn't match. It was able to see through illusions, the power levels of those beyond your dimension, and even see through usually invisible fluctuations in force. However, this was just the first level of the technique. Upon reaching the second level, your gaze could gain coercive effects of its own. In that case, your eyes could be used to disrupt and interrupt the flow of force. Visit. For a better user experience reading to this point, Lionel couldn't help but remember back to the flock of birds White City had brought to attack Camelot during Terrain's invasion. That species had been able to use their eyes to disrupt the flow of force, and it rendered mages completely useless. This technique seemed to take this to an extreme. If you were potent enough and you could see through the weak point of a technique with enough speed, just your gaze alone could force it to disperse. It was truly a beautifully constructed technique. In fact, Lionel felt the same about them all. He almost didn't care enough to even look through the Luxnix family techniques. He was completely immersed in the world of his mother's creation. It took a lot for Lionel to be impressed, mostly because with his mind he was usually able to quickly deduce how people accomplished the things they did. Such an ability made it difficult for anyone to move him from his baseline. However, Lionel had nothing but praise for his mother. The straw that broke the camel's back was most definitely when Lionel saw a version of his mother had created that was several times better and more flexible than his own. Instead, she called it. The very same crystal balls that Lionel had received all of his gifts from were exactly an application of this technique. However, that was the easiest part to accept. What was absolutely fascinating was that a formation of could have a law attached to it. This law would be governed by your empire's might. Or, in Lionel's case, his king's might. So long as you were within the confines of and the world was not broken, this rule had to be followed. The latest _IP_SODIs are on _the website. That was when it clicked for Lionel. The law his mother must have attached to his gifts was that the world would open so long as Lionel was the one to touch them. Wow. Lionel was floored. The complexity of this technique was beyond his wildest imagination. Chapter 1104. Lionel felt that his was inferior to his mother's in almost every way, shape and form. The only advantage he would have was in the sturdiness of the space he could create thanks to his version being anchored by earth force. But, whether it was flexibility of use, stamina consumption, and applications in battle, it was a clean sweep for. Not to mention all of this, was practically like having a domain of your choosing on command. Of course, the law you set worked better the simpler it was, so this wasn't exactly true. But, if an ability like this was paired with Lionel's intelligence in battle, who knew how many people he could play to death with it? Lionel's fingers subconsciously stretched outward, wiggling about lightly as force followed their movements. Lionel had thought that he wouldn't be used to the foundational magic system his mother used to create this technique. After all, he had used Camelot's magic system to turn an artistic conception into reality, but his mother hadn't returned to Earth in a very long time, so she shouldn't have had the time to learn about it. But after analyzing the technique, Lionel was shocked to find that the foundation his mother used wasn't only similar, it was identical. He had no other way of explaining this other than chalking it up to his mother's world spirit. There didn't seem to be another way for her to have known about it. This conclusion led Lionel down another shocking revelation. His mother was like a cheat code. He had spent so much time analyzing and parsing out the secrets of Camelot's magic system, but his mother was years if not decades ahead of him. Subconsciously, the easiest first layer of formed for Lionel, a small crystal ball appearing before him like a blown bubble. It reflected delicate rainbow colors as though it might pop at any moment. Visit. For the best no-understanding experience still observing Lionel up in the sky, Eleanor blinked in shock for already the third time that day. Was one of her most complicated techniques. Wasn't it a bit exaggerated to form a rudimentary form of it in just a few moments? I see. So that magic system fell in your hands? Lionel had no idea how correct he was. As the wielder of Earth's world spirit, Eleanor had many wide-ranging abilities. One of these abilities was being able to assimilate with the natural force arts that formed the foundation of Earth. When Camelot formed Avalon and became part of Earth's reality, Alienor gained access to the natural force arts that formed their foundation. This, in turn, allowed her to improve her technique to the level it was currently at now. It could be said that Lionel had been helping his mom from countless light years away, something even she only became aware of right this moment. Had he never cleared Camelot's zone, their magic system wouldn't have fused with Earth and his mother would have never learned of them. A flicker of guilt lit Alienor's gaze. How ironic. What a terrible mother I am. The idea that her son had been sweating and bleeding for her benefit made tears run down Alienor's cheeks. She couldn't seem to control her flood of emotions at all. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Even now, all she could give her son was wealth and treasures. She was under no illusions that this somehow made up for all the years of his life that she had missed. Lionel was oblivious to all of this. He had no idea that it wasn't because his mother was decades ahead of him, but rather that as the world spirit wielder she didn't need to study Camelot's magic system like he did. It came as naturally to her as breathing. Technically, she had learned the magic system at the same time she did. However, functionally, they might as well have had thousands of years of separation between them. A light purple aura formed around him, forcing the rainbow colors of the bubble before him to take on various hues of violet instead. This is a good thing. It also means that I'm right, Lionel mused. Logically, Mother should have a far wider view of the dimensional verse than I do. The fact that she had so many options before her yet still chose to use Camelot's magic system in specific must mean that even compared to all of them, this system is far superior. This conclusion made Lionel feel at ease. Before he had guesses. But he couldn't be absolutely certain. Right then, his finger flashed outward, a beam of spear force cutting through and crashing onto the surface of the bubble. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. A blade mark rebounded off the surface of the construction, leaving a deep mark. However, the world managed to quickly mend itself. Lionel calmly observed this before sending a fist covered in fist force forward. Unlike his level 2 spear force, this fist force was only the most ordinary level 1 fist force. And yet, the bubble shattered on the lightest impact, raining down motes of crystals and light. Lionel nodded to himself. He had set the law of this by stating that it was invulnerable to blade edges. However, by skewing the law so heavily in one direction, it made it incredibly fragile to blunt trauma. Obviously, since Lionel's blade had left a mark, the wasn't invulnerable. So, his law wasn't the end-all, be-all, at least not with his current proficiency. However, Lionel still felt that such a thing was endlessly useful in combat. If I can use my mother's research to improve just what would the result be? Lionel's mind worked in overdrive, but he felt like his king's might was missing something. His attention turned back to his mother's techniques before he found exactly what had forced his dreamscape to spark. Visit. For the best no_vel_underscore_it_understand experience. Chapter 1105 was clearly a play on Emperor's Might as far as Lionel could tell. But its use was far more than just that. In fact, it was quite fascinating. This technique was a method of Emperor's Might manipulation. As things stood now, under normal circumstances, Emperor's Might was like a sledgehammer. In its base form, both Alienor and Lionel could use it like a flood, trying to drown people out with it. However, just because it could be done, didn't mean that this was the most efficient way of doing so. Combined Emperor's Might with concepts of visualizations and artistic conception. In fact, if Lionel was correct, him taking time to comprehend could actually go a long way in helping him master the fifth-dimensional layer of. It had to be remembered that it was Lionel's shallow understanding of the fifth-dimensional layer of that led him down a path of using artistic conception to create mage arts. The fifth dimension was all about elevating the mind to release the shackles the body might harbor. This symbiotic relationship between mind and body was incredibly important. As such, using and mastering it would actually give Lionel a path toward increasing the speed of his improvement through the fifth dimension. Right now, Lionel's king's might was nothing more than a formless fog. Whenever he made use of it, it would permeate his general surroundings before eventually sinking into whatever target he had set it on. The trouble with this approach was that it wasn't only a waste of energy, but it was also slow and not nearly as potent as it could be. Visit. For the best no_vel_it_understand experience, the solution to this seemed quite simple. Since Lionel had such high dream force affinity, and he now knew that his king's might was a derivative of it, why not simply take control of this fog and change its form? Of course, he could do this, and this would likely help mitigate the slowing and wastage of his king's might. However, that was all. It was a mere surface solution to it all. It was only after reading through that Lionel came to understand why he was so lacking in his use of his lineage factor. He was only at the first tier of the fifth dimension. He had yet to properly refine his mental state. In his current condition, his mind was like a wild and untamable beast that acted as it pleased. Lionel was under the illusion that he controlled himself, but just how much of his actions were based on his innate disposition? How much of himself was he controlling? And how much was decided at birth by an arrangement of his genes? It was quite the profound question. Why was it that some people endlessly procrastinated while others always seemed to be working? Was it really something as intangible as will? Or was it just a natural disposition? Or maybe will itself was decided by one's innate disposition? Remove the guesswork from all of this. So long as Lionel practiced it properly, he would be able to rein in his mind to a certain extent. And by attaching an artistic conception to his king's might, it too would become several times more powerful. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_g experience. Once he managed to do that, the laws he set for or whatever upgraded version of his that he formed would be exponentially more potent. Each level has a corresponding force art attached to it. Each really seems to be as complex as a natural force art. Was this really created by a person? Lionel couldn't help but be impressed once again. He had never seen a force art created by a person be so complex. Whether it was his auspicious aura force art or Camelot's magic system force art, both were exceedingly complicated. However, these force arts fell somewhere between the two in complexity, with Camelot's being by far the most complex. Was split into 9 levels with 3 major dividing lines. Despite being called, this name was actually more of a placeholder to convey the foundation of the technique's secrets. In reality, the artistic conception used was up to the user. This also allowed one the flexibility to improve upon in the future. Lionel wouldn't be surprised if his mother used the artistic conception of a dragon to give her emperor's might form. However, Lionel wouldn't even know where to start if he chose that path. He had never seen a dragon nor seen the depiction of one. Though he had read and seen a lot of them in fiction back in his younger years, that wasn't nearly enough. Wait, do dragons actually exist? Lionel's brow furrowed before he shook his head. That hardly mattered right now. What he needed was a proper artistic conception, one that was both easy to observe and easy to scale. With Lionel's thinking speed, he immediately thought of several possibilities. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_g experience, the first was Little Blackstar. Though the little guy seemed quite adorable and unassuming, he was both a shadow sovereign and now an heir to the void beasts, a creature that even Lionel's own father deemed it important to leave a message behind about. It might even be the case that void beasts were far more powerful than dragons, if dragons even existed, that is. The second choice was to choose something far more abstract, like a disaster world. So long as Lionel kept visiting disaster worlds of similar elements, he would also be able to continuously upgrade the artistic conception of his king's might. In addition, he would likewise be able to improve his universal cycles. It was like killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Both of these ideas felt excellent, but for some reason they left an uncomfortable feeling in Lionel's gut. He could somehow tell that if he really took this path, his king's might wouldn't like it, but he couldn't quite understand why. Until it all clicked. The difference between Emperor's might and King's might was that while the former gathered strength from outside influences, the latter gathered strength from yourself. Lionel suddenly felt a throbbing above his right hip, and he subconsciously reached a hand downward. A searing heat threatened to torch everything in the room, but for some reason Lionel felt exceedingly comfortable. Visit. For a better user experience in that moment, he felt like he knew exactly what he had to do. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.